She had crossed half a continent for a man who never came. The platform at Harrow Creek Station stood empty under a sky the color of a bruise, and Evelyn Mercer stood on it with a trunk that held everything she owned and a letter she'd read so many times the creases had gone soft. The station master wouldn't meet her eyes. The other passengers had long since gone. Somewhere out on the Nevada flats, a coyote called once and fell silent, as if even the wilderness thought better of announcing itself tonight. She had come here to start over. Instead, she was stranded. If you've ever bet everything on a promise that turned out to be nothing. Stay with me. Like this video, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, and don't go anywhere. Because what happens next to this woman will change everything you think you know about where home really is. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday in April, slipped under the door of Evelyn Mercer's rented room in Cincinnati like something ashamed of itself. She almost didn't open it. She'd been living in that room for 7 months by then, a narrow rectangle above a laundry on Sycamore Street, with a window that looked out on a brick wall and a landlady who knocked every Friday for rent and never once asked how Evelyn was getting on. The room cost $4 a week. Evelyn made 6 teaching reading to workers' children 3 evenings out of 7, and the remaining $2 went toward food, which meant she ate enough to stay upright and not much more. She was 31 years old. She had a teaching certificate, a modest inheritance that had been stolen from her by a man she'd trusted, and a reputation in Cincinnati society that had been thoroughly destroyed along with the inheritance. She was not by any measure doing well. The letter was from a man named Douglas Crane of Harrow Creek, Nevada Territory. He'd placed an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times, one of those publications that circulated among women in exactly Evelyn's situation. Educated, broke, and out of reasonable options. She'd answered 6 advertisements. 5 hadn't written back. Douglas Crane had. His letters were not flowery. She gave him credit for that. He wrote in a plain, blunt hand about his parcel of land east of the Carson River, about a house that needed a woman's attention, about his belief that a practical partnership between 2 people of similar temperament was worth more than romantic notions that faded fast in hard country. He asked about her background, her health, whether she could ride. She wrote back honestly, about her teaching experience, her situation, the fact that she'd never been on a horse in her life but was willing to learn. He wrote that he appreciated plain dealing. He sent $50 for the train fare. She spent 3 weeks convincing herself not to go. She spent 1 afternoon packing her trunk. The journey west took 11 days. She sat in the women's car and watched Ohio flatten into Indiana. Indiana surrender to Illinois. The Mississippi appear like a rumor and then like a fact. The plains opening up endlessly beyond it. She ate the food she'd packed herself, boiled eggs and bread and dried apricots, and rationed it carefully because she had very little money beyond what Crane had sent for the ticket, and she didn't know when she'd eat properly again. She wrote in a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. Not a diary exactly, more a list of things she intended to do once she arrived. Help with the house, learn to manage a kitchen garden, establish a school if there were children nearby who needed teaching. She had always been better at making lists than at sleeping, and the train made it difficult to sleep anyway. She arrived at Harrow Creek Station on a Wednesday evening in late May. The platform was 40 feet of weathered planking. The station itself was a single room with a pot-bellied stove and a bench. The station master, a heavy-set man named Gideon Phelps, with a walrus mustache and the air of someone who'd given up expecting good news, helped her down from the car and set her trunk beside the door. "You meeting someone?" he asked. "Douglas Crane," she said. "Do you know him?" Phelps looked at her for a moment too long. "I know of him," he said carefully. She waited 2 hours. The sun dropped behind the hills to the west, and the air went cold the way desert air does, suddenly and without apology. A couple of other passengers had been met by wagons and driven away. The platform emptied. Phelps came out twice to check on her, and twice went back inside without saying what she could see he was thinking. On the 3rd time, he brought her a cup of coffee and stood next to her and looked out at the dark. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't know how to say this except straight." "Then say it straight." "Douglas Crane left Harrow Creek 2 weeks ago, packed his wagon and went. Word is he took up with a widow woman over in Elko County." He paused. "I don't think he's coming." Evelyn held the coffee cup with both hands. It was warm, and she focused on that. "Did he tell anyone he'd sent for a wife?" she asked. Not that I heard. She nodded. She drank the coffee. She said, "Is there a hotel in town?" There was, but it was 3 miles east, and she had no wagon and no horse and no way to get there in the dark. And Phelps didn't have a horse to lend her and felt terrible about it. He let her sit inside the station until 9 o'clock, when he had to lock up and go home to his wife. And then she was standing alone on the platform with her trunk and the night and the slow comprehension of how badly things had gone wrong. She had $18.40. The return ticket to Cincinnati would cost her 12 of those, and that was assuming she could get passage on a train within the next few days, which was not guaranteed. She could afford the hotel for perhaps 3 nights. After that, she would be making different kinds of decisions. She sat on her trunk and looked out at the Nevada dark. It was enormous. She hadn't expected it to be that big. In Cincinnati, the dark was always interrupted by gas lamps, by the noise of neighbors, by the general busyness of a city that never quite stopped. Here, the dark was a physical thing. It pressed against the station windows and lay heavy across the flat land, and made the stars above seem impossibly far away and numerous at once. She was not, she told herself, going to cry. She was furious, which was better. She was furious at Douglas Crane for his easy handwriting and his practical letters and his $50 for train fare that had apparently been the entire extent of his commitment. She was furious at herself for coming. She was furious at the situation she'd been in that made coming seem like a reasonable choice. And she was furious at the man back in Cincinnati who'd put her in that situation. And she was furious at the darkness and the cold and the complete absence of options. It was, she thought, a very pure kind of anger. There was nothing mixed in it, no grief yet, no despair, just a clean, clarifying rage that kept her sitting upright on her trunk when she might otherwise have folded. That was when she saw the light. It was far out on the flat, maybe half a mile or more, a small yellow point moving slowly through the dark. A lantern, carried by someone or hung from a wagon. It bobbed and steadied and moved roughly in her direction, though not exactly. More like it was following a track she couldn't see, aimed at something other than the station. She stood up. Later, she would not be able to explain clearly what made her do what she did next. She would say it was the cold. She would say it was that she had no other choices. Both of those things were true, but they weren't the whole of it. The whole of it was closer to something she couldn't articulate, the sense that sitting still was no longer something she was capable of. That if she stayed on that platform until morning, she would arrive at a state of mind that would be difficult to come back from, and that the light moving across the dark was at least motion, at least direction, at least something other than the fixed point of her own humiliation. She picked up her smallest bag, the trunk she left at the station, hoping Phelps would be decent about it in the morning, and she walked toward the light. The ground was harder than it looked and uneven in ways she couldn't predict. She turned her ankle twice on rocks she couldn't see, not badly, but enough to make her slow down and pick her way more carefully. The air smelled of sage and something drier underneath it, dust and mineral, the smell of a land that didn't particularly need water. The lantern moved and she followed it, keeping it ahead of her, and gradually the distance closed enough that she could make out the shape of a wagon and a horse, moving along what turned out to be a track pressed into the earth by long use. She called out, "Hello!" The wagon stopped. A man's voice, guarded. "Who's there?" "My name is Evelyn Mercer. I'm looking for—" She paused because what she was looking for was not easy to name. Shelter. Help. Anything. "I arrived on the evening train and the person meeting me didn't come. I need somewhere to stay tonight." A long silence. The lantern held steady. "Where are you?" the man said. "To your left, about 20 yards. Another silence, and then the lantern swung in her direction, and she was caught in the edge of its light, standing in the scrub in her traveling clothes, with her bag in her hand, probably looking, she thought, like exactly the kind of trouble a man alone in the dark would want to avoid. "You're on foot?" he said. "Yes." He didn't say anything else for a moment. She could see him more clearly now. Not a young man, somewhere in his middle 30s maybe, lean in the way people get when they work outdoors, with a hat pulled low. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not hostile, not warm either, just careful. "I've got a ranch a mile east," he said finally. "You can sleep in the barn." The barn turned out to be warmer than she expected. It smelled of hay and horses and the comfortable funk of large animals. and he gave her a blanket without being asked and pointed to a clean corner, and she slept for 5 hours straight and woke to gray light coming through the gaps in the walls and the sound of a child crying. His name was Caleb Boone. She pieced this together over the course of that first morning, not from him. He offered very little, but from observation and from the few words he actually said, and from what she could read in the shape of the place he'd built and the way it sat in the landscape. The ranch was called, according to a worn board nailed above the gate, the Boone Spread, which struck her as one of the least imaginative names she'd encountered, but also somehow fitting, because the place itself had that quality. It was not trying to be anything other than exactly what it was. A house of 2 rooms and a loft, solid but unadorned. A barn bigger than the house, because here the priorities were sensible. A water pump, a kitchen garden in early stages, 3 horses and a small herd of cattle she could hear somewhere beyond the ridge. The child was a girl of about 6, small and fair-haired, who appeared in the barn doorway at first light, and stopped when she saw Evelyn and stared. Evelyn stared back. The girl's face was dirty. Her hair needed brushing badly. She was wearing a dress that had been mended so many times that the original garment was barely visible beneath the patches. She held a rag doll by one leg, absently, the way children carry beloved things they've forgotten they're carrying. "Hello?" Evelyn said. The girl said nothing. She turned and disappeared back toward the house. Caleb appeared 20 minutes later and told Evelyn she was welcome to breakfast if she wanted it before heading into town. He said this in the tone of a man completing an obligation rather than extending a welcome, and she understood it as such. She followed him into the house and found the kitchen cold. The stove had only just been lit, and the breakfast supplies in modest disarray. He was trying to make biscuits. She watched him for a moment without comment. "May I?" she said. He looked at her. "You know how?" "I've been feeding myself for 31 years, she said. "I've developed some competence." Something moved across his face, almost a reaction, quickly suppressed. "Go ahead," he said, and stepped back from the stove. The girl, Clara, she learned, her name was Clara, sat at the table through the whole of breakfast without speaking once. She ate what was put in front of her and watched Evelyn with that same steady, evaluating stare, the kind children give people they haven't yet decided about. Evelyn didn't try to coax her into conversation. She'd worked with children long enough to know that coaxing rarely helped. Caleb ate fast and without much attention to the food. The way men ate when eating was something they needed to get through before returning to work. "I'll drive you to town after I check on the herd," he said. "That's very kind." "It's not kindness," he said. "It's just practical." She looked at him directly. "All right," she said. "It's just practical." He looked slightly uncomfortable, as if he'd expected her to take offense. She hadn't. She'd been around enough plain-dealing people to recognize the difference between rudeness and honesty, and Caleb Boone, whatever else he was, seemed to be honest. She helped Clara clear the table. The girl allowed this, watching Evelyn's hands as she stacked the plates, and once, very quickly, reached out and touched the small cameo brooch at Evelyn's collar, and then pulled her hand back. "It was my mother's," Evelyn said. Clara didn't respond, but she looked at the brooch for a long time after that. Eat. The wagon ride into town took the better part of an hour, and most of it passed in silence. The Nevada landscape opened up around them, wide and flat and pitilessly blue-skied, the kind of country that made a person feel simultaneously very small and very awake. Evelyn sat on the wagon bench and looked at it and tried to think clearly about her situation. The $18, the $12 for a return ticket, the $6 remaining, which was not enough to resolve anything. She could wire her cousin in Philadelphia. Margaret was not fond of her, but she was capable of small acts of duty, and this qualified as the kind of situation that called for small acts of duty. The wire would cost $1 and change. Margaret's response would take at least 4 days. The hotel would cost her money she could barely afford. It was not a good set of options. Harrow Creek itself was not much. A main street with a general store, a livery, a doctor's office, a saloon, a handful of other buildings that served the surrounding ranches and farms. There was a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Aldine Fitch, which Phelps at the station had mentioned was where respectable women stayed. Evelyn found it without trouble. Mrs. Fitch was a sharp-faced woman of about 50 with an eye that missed very little. She sized Evelyn up in about 4 seconds and charged her $1.20 a night, which was more than Evelyn had hoped, but less than catastrophic. "You came in on last night's train," Mrs. Fitch said. "Yes." "And who are you meeting?" "Douglas Crane?" Mrs. Fitch's expression didn't change. "I heard he'd gone to Elko." "So I'm told." "You were expecting to marry him?" "I was told I was," Evelyn said. Mrs. Fitch looked at her for another moment. "You're not the first," she said. "He did this once before, 3 years ago, with a woman from Tennessee. She ended up staying on as a seamstress. There's worse ways to land." She handed Evelyn a room key. "Breakfast is at 7. Don't be late." The room was clean and small and quiet, and Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, not doing anything in particular. Outside the window, the main street of Harrow Creek went about its business. A wagon, a dog, 2 men talking in front of the general store, the ordinary textures of a small frontier town that didn't know or care about her. She tried to be precise about this in her own mind, in a very precarious position. She had come west to escape one ruined life and had managed to arrive at a new one without the circumstances she'd been promised. The practical question was how to stabilize, and she needed to think about it clearly rather than emotionally. The emotion, she decided, could wait. She pulled out her notebook and wrote down everything she had and everything she needed and tried to find where those 2 lists might intersect. It didn't look promising. She was still doing this, cross-referencing and discarding options, when there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Clara Boone standing in the hallway. The girl was alone. She had clearly walked here herself, which was a significant distance for a child her size. She was slightly out of breath, and her dress had a new smudge of dust on the front. She was looking at Evelyn with an expression that was very precisely nothing, the expression of a child trying hard not to look like she was asking for something. "Clara," Evelyn said, "does your father know where you are?" Clara shook her head. "How did you get here?" Clara pointed back vaguely in the direction they'd come from. "You walked? From the ranch?" Clara looked at her. "That's more than a mile," Evelyn said. "In the sun." Clara continued to look at her. "Come in," Evelyn said, and stepped back. The girl came in and stood in the middle of the room and looked around at it with that same careful attention she brought to everything. She looked at Evelyn's bag on the chair, at the notebook open on the bed, at the brooch that Evelyn had unpinned and set on the small bedside table. She looked at the brooch for a long time. "You can hold it if you want," Evelyn said. Clara picked it up very carefully with both hands, the way children hold things they know are fragile and important. She turned it over. She looked at the miniature painted on the back, a woman's face, small and faded, and then at Evelyn. "That's my mother," Evelyn said. "She died when I was 14. Clara was still looking at her. "How long has your mother been gone?" Evelyn asked. Something shifted in Clara's face. Not tears, nothing so straightforward as that, just a quality of alteration, the particular kind of quiet that isn't peace, but the shape that grief takes in children who've had to carry it alone for a while. She held up 3 fingers. 3 years, Evelyn said. Clara nodded. 3 years ago, Clara would have been 3. She'd been 3 years old when her mother died and 6 years old now and silent, and Evelyn looked at this small, fair-haired girl standing in a boarding house room in Nevada and felt something move in her chest that she wasn't prepared for. She sat down on the edge of the bed so she was closer to the child's height. "You came to find me," she said. Not a question. Clara looked at her feet, then back up. "Why?" Evelyn said. And Clara, who had not spoken, Evelyn had begun to suspect she might not speak at all, or couldn't, or had chosen not to, opened her mouth and in a voice that was barely there, paper-thin from disuse, said, "Please." Just that. One word. Evelyn sat very still. "Please what, Clara?" "Please." The voice was rough with non-use, raspy and small, and carrying the whole weight of what she couldn't say yet. "Don't leave us alone." Come on. Caleb Boone rode into town at a clip that said he'd been riding hard and didn't bother to slow much before he reached Mrs. Fitch's boarding house. He dismounted at the rail and went inside and was directed upstairs and arrived at Evelyn's door breathing slightly faster than usual and knocked twice. When she opened it, he saw Clara immediately and closed his eyes for a moment. Clara. His voice was measured, but there was something cracked underneath the measuring. I've been looking all over this. He stopped, looked at Evelyn. I'm sorry, she's not supposed to eat. She walked, Evelyn said. More than a mile. In the afternoon heat. I know, he said. He crouched in the doorway to his daughter's level. Why'd you do that? Clara looked at him and then at Evelyn and didn't say anything. She spoke, Evelyn said quietly. Caleb's head came up sharply. Just a few words, but she spoke. He looked at his daughter for a long moment, the cracked thing in his expression now fully visible, and Clara looked back at him with those unreadable eyes, and then she did something Evelyn wouldn't have predicted. She held out the brooch. Not to Caleb, to Evelyn, giving it back. But her other hand, her free hand, she held out to Evelyn as well. Evelyn took the brooch with one hand and Clara's hand with the other, and the girl's fingers were small and very firm. Caleb Boone stood up slowly. He looked at his daughter's hand in Evelyn's, and then at Evelyn's face, and then off at a point somewhere above the window. Mrs. Mercer, he said finally, I don't know what you need or what your plans are. I don't have a right to ask you anything after... He stopped again. What I mean to say is, the ranch could use another stop. He was not a man who talked around the edges of things, she was starting to understand, but he'd arrived at a thing that required asking for help, and he didn't find that easy. We don't have much, he said finally. The place is rough. It's hard work, and the pay I could offer right now isn't much. But if you needed somewhere to stay while you figured out what comes next... Mr. Boone, she said. He stopped. How long were you planning to ask? She said. He looked at her. What? You've restarted that sentence 4 times. Something moved across his face. Possibly, under different circumstances, it might have been humor. Fair, he said. I'll stay 1 week, she said, in exchange for room and board. After that we can reassess. He nodded. That's fair. I'll need a proper room, not the barn. There's a room off the kitchen, he said. It's not much. I've been living in a room above a laundry in Cincinnati, she said. I'm not particular. He looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. Clara's hand tightened very slightly around Evelyn's fingers. Hot. She wrote the letter to her cousin Margaret that evening and sent the wire in the morning as a precaution, but by the time she'd done both, she was already understanding, in a way she couldn't fully articulate, that she was not going to Cincinnati. Not yet. Maybe not at all. She didn't examine this too closely. She'd learned by now that examining certain feelings too directly made them disappear, and she needed this one, whatever it was, obligation or stubbornness or the particular kind of response that Clara's voice had woken in her. She needed it to stay functional. Feelings examined too hard became theories, and theories didn't get any practical work done. The room off the kitchen was small and had a single window that looked out at the pump and the beginning of the kitchen garden. The garden had been attempted and then partly abandoned, she could see. Rows started and not finished, weeds making inroads, a few early plants fighting for survival against the neglect. She noted it without judgment. A man running a ranch alone with a child of 6 had other priorities. Her first morning at the ranch, she woke at 5:30 out of habit, and went to the kitchen and started the stove and had coffee ready when Caleb came in at 6. He stopped when he smelled it. You didn't have to, he started. I was up, she said. He sat down without arguing. He drank the coffee and looked at her over the rim of the cup with the expression of a man recalibrating some prior assumption. Do you always get up at 5:30? He said. Generally at 5, she said. I slept late. He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been skepticism and drank the rest of his coffee and went out to check the horses. Clara appeared at 6:15. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Evelyn scramble eggs. Good morning, Evelyn said. Clara came and sat at the table. Do you want to help? Clara slid off her chair and stood next to Evelyn at the stove. Evelyn showed her how to stir without letting the eggs sit too long on the heat, how you kept them moving so they didn't go rubbery. Clara was careful and serious about it, the way she was careful and serious about everything. There, Evelyn said when they were done. You made breakfast. Clara looked at the eggs. She looked at Evelyn. She sat back down. She didn't smile, but something in her posture shifted very slightly in the direction of ease. The week passed in the way that hard-working weeks pass, fast and full, without much space for reflection. There was a great deal to do. The house had been maintained in the sense that it hadn't fallen down, but it had the quality of a place where the minimum necessary effort had been applied for a long time, which was not a criticism of Caleb, but a statement of mathematics. One man, a large parcel of land, a herd to manage, and a child to raise was not a situation that left time for anything optional. The kitchen garden needed the most immediate attention, and Evelyn set herself to it in the first 2 days, pulling weeds and assessing what was salvageable and replanting what wasn't with seeds she found in a wooden box in the pantry. She didn't ask permission. She just did it, and Caleb came around the side of the house one afternoon and stood watching her for a moment, and then went back to whatever he'd been doing without comment. She fixed the window latch in the front room that was letting in cold air. She found a crack in the wall near the loft ladder that had been patched with something that hadn't held and repacked it with a mix of ash and mud and clay that she'd seen used to similar purpose when she was a girl visiting her grandmother in rural Pennsylvania. She reorganized the pantry, which had fallen into a state where nothing could be found without excavating. None of this was requested. She simply saw what needed doing and did it, which was how she'd always operated, and which in Cincinnati had been called presumptuous, and on the Boone spread nobody seemed to mind. Caleb didn't thank her. He noticed. She could tell that he noticed, the way his gaze moved to the fixed latch, the reorganized pantry, the recovering garden. But he didn't comment, and he didn't thank her, and she didn't want either. The work was its own thing. The work was she was starting to understand the best way she knew to be present in a place, to actually be somewhere instead of just occupying space. Clara followed her, not always, not intrusively, but in the way of a child who has decided someone is worth watching, at a careful distance, appearing around doorways, sitting on the fence, watching Evelyn work the garden, materializing at the kitchen table at mealtimes without being called. She still wasn't talking much. The word she'd said at the boarding house had been, apparently, a significant expenditure, and she was rebuilding toward it at her own pace. But she was there, consistently, quietly, persistently there. On the 5th day, Evelyn found her in the barn, attempting to braid the tail of one of the horses, a patient old mare named Duchess, who clearly had significant experience tolerating the attentions of small children. Clara was doing it badly, her fingers getting tangled, and she had a look of fierce concentration that Evelyn recognized as a child, not willing to ask for help but running out of options. "May I?" Evelyn said. Clara moved over. Evelyn showed her the basic braid. 3 sections, steady tension, the way you kept even pressure so the whole thing didn't go crooked. Duchess stood immovably patient and contributed nothing but her tail. "Now you try," Evelyn said, and stepped back. Clara's second attempt was better. Her third was almost respectable. She stood back and looked at her work on Duchess's tail, and then up at Evelyn, and this time she did something that stopped Evelyn completely, that she'd carry with her for a long time afterward. She smiled. It was small and uncertain, and she covered it almost immediately with a more neutral expression, the way children do when they're not sure if showing you they're happy is safe. But it had been there, and Evelyn had seen it, and she turned away to pretend she hadn't, because making too much of a first smile was the fastest way to make sure you never saw another one. "Good work," she said, to Duchess's broadside. Duchess flicked an ear. Cha-chan. On the evening of the 6th day, Caleb came in from the range later than usual, dirty and tired in the deep tissue way that meant something had gone wrong and required more from him than he had. He sat at the supper table and ate without talking, and Clara ate beside him, and Evelyn ate across from them both, and the silence was the kind that didn't need filling. After Clara went up to the loft, Evelyn poured Caleb more coffee and sat back down. "What happened today?" she said. He looked at his cup. "Lost a calf to a fence line that gave way near the south pasture. The fence has needed repair for 2 months, but I hadn't—" He stopped. "I hadn't gotten to it. Can it be fixed?" "The fence, yeah, the calf's gone." "I'm sorry." He shook his head slightly, not dismissively, but the way people do when they're trying to move past a loss before it gets too large to move past. "It's part of it," he said. She wanted to say something else. She wasn't sure what. There was a quality to him that made conversation feel like something requiring navigation, like a landscape you couldn't read the contours of until you were already in it. "You've been doing this alone for 3 years," she said. He looked at her. Not unfriendly, just careful. "3 years is a long time to run a place this size by yourself," she said. "You do what you need to do." "That's true," she said, "but it takes a cost." He didn't answer that. He drank his coffee and looked at the table, and she left it alone. Because pressing Caleb Boone was like pressing on a door that was bolted from the other side. You could feel the resistance, and you could understand that the resistance wasn't personal, and you could choose to be patient about it. She was beginning to understand, without being told, what the last 3 years had been. A wife gone. A child who'd stopped speaking. A ranch that required a person's whole self to maintain and left nothing over for anything else. He'd been holding everything together with the specific kind of determination that doesn't look heroic from the inside. The kind that's just getting up every morning and doing what needs doing and going to bed and getting up and doing it again, with no particular hope of things getting easier, just the stubborn refusal to let them fall apart. She respected it. She didn't romanticize it. She'd seen enough of what that kind of survival cost people to know it wasn't a condition to admire from a distance. Her week was up tomorrow. She sat with that fact for a moment and then said, "Mr. Boone?" "Caleb," he said. Oddly, something she hadn't expected. She'd been Mrs. Mercer for 6 days, and he'd barely said her name at all, and now he was correcting her on his own. "Caleb," she said, "I'd like to propose another week." He looked at her with that careful look. "The garden will be productive in another 10 days if the weather holds," she said, "and I'd like to—" She paused. "I'd like to stay long enough to see how Clara does." Something moved behind his eyes. Complicated. He didn't say anything right away. "It's not charity," she said, because she could see him preparing to refuse on those grounds. "I'm not good at receiving charity either. It's a practical arrangement. You get another pair of hands. I get room and board and time to figure out my situation." "Your situation," he said. Not unkindly. "I have a letter into a cousin in Philadelphia. She may be able to send money. I may be able to find something in town. I don't know yet." She kept her voice level. "But I know I'd rather be useful here than sitting in Mrs. Fitch's boarding house counting what I have left." He looked at his coffee cup, then out the window at the dark Nevada night. "Another week," he said. "To start," she said. And somewhere above them, in the loft, a floorboard shifted. The way floorboards shift when a small child has been lying awake listening and only now, satisfied, rolls over to sleep. The second week became a third, and the third bled into a month before either of them acknowledged it directly. This was not, Evelyn told herself, a failure of planning. It was more that the days on the Boone spread had a quality she hadn't anticipated. They moved fast, and they moved full. And by the time evening came, she was too tired for the kind of reflection that might have led her to make different choices. The letter from Margaret arrived on a Thursday, 2.5 weeks after she'd sent the wire. It was 3 paragraphs long, carefully worded, and communicated in the language of distant obligation that Margaret could, if pressed, send $30. But that Evelyn should understand that Margaret's own circumstances were not easy, and that $30 was a significant sum, and that perhaps Evelyn might consider whether she had, in fact, exhausted all local options before requesting the money. Evelyn read it twice. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket and went back to the kitchen garden, where she'd been staking the bean plants against a wind that had picked up from the southwest. She did not write back for 4 days, which was long enough for her to know she wasn't going to ask for the $30. It wasn't pride exactly. It was closer to a calculation. $30 would get her to Philadelphia, where she would stay in Margaret's spare room and look for teaching work and restart the particular kind of grinding, lonely, respectable poverty she'd been living before Douglas Crane's letter arrived. That was a real option. She wasn't pretending it wasn't. But somewhere in the third week of waking at 5 and starting the stove and watching Clara eat breakfast with increasing appetite and willingness to be at the table, the option had become less compelling than she could fully explain. She wrote Margaret a brief note thanking her for the offer and saying she had found a situation and would not need the funds. She sealed it and rode with Caleb to town on a supply run that Friday and posted it herself. On the way back, Caleb said, "What did your cousin say?" "She offered money," Evelyn said. "Are you taking it?" "No." He drove the wagon for a 1/4 mile without responding. Then, "Why not?" "Because "I don't need it yet," she said, which was technically true and was also not the whole answer, and from the way he didn't push it, she suspected he understood that. Well, the ranch began to change in small ways that were hard to point at directly, but were visible in accumulation. The kitchen garden produced its first real harvest in the third week of June, radishes and early lettuces and a handful of snap peas that Clara ate, standing in the garden, still warm from the sun, before Evelyn could intercept them for supper. Evelyn let her. There were worse things than a child eating peas directly from the vine. Clara had developed a habit of checking the garden each morning, walking the rows with a seriousness of purpose that Evelyn recognized as her own, doing a thing with her whole attention, or not doing it at all. The pantry stayed organized because Evelyn organized it every time she used it, which meant Caleb could find things without excavating and stopped having that small particular frustration in the morning when he was trying to get out the door. He didn't say this was better. He just stopped looking frustrated when he opened the pantry door. The window latch held. The wall near the loft ladder stayed patched. Evelyn found 3 other places where the house was losing heat, gaps in the framing above 2 of the windows, and a section of the floorboards near the far wall that had warped away from the baseboards, and addressed them in turn, working in the evenings when the light allowed and the cooking was done. Caleb came in one evening and found her on her knees beside the far wall, pressing a strip of wool batting she'd cut from a worn blanket into the gap between the floor and the baseboard. "You're going to run out of things to fix," he said. "I'll find more," she said. He crouched and looked at what she'd done. "Where'd you learn that?" "My grandmother. She had a farmhouse in Pennsylvania that was always threatening to fall apart. She said you either kept ahead of it or let it beat you." "Smart woman. Very." Evelyn sat back on her heels and looked at the baseboard. She also said the fastest way to keep a man comfortable was to make sure the house he lived in stopped trying to kill him through cold. She didn't look at him when she said it. She could feel him deciding whether to be amused by that. "My wife used to say something similar," he said. It was the first time he'd mentioned her. Evelyn didn't make a thing of it. "Was she practical?" "She was," he said after a moment. "Practical in ways I didn't appreciate properly when she was here." He stood up. "I'll get those floorboards fixed before winter. Don't let me forget." "I won't," she said. He went to check on the horses and she stayed where she was for a moment, on her knees by the baseboard, and felt the particular texture of that conversation, small and ordinary and careful on both sides, like 2 people moving around something fragile without naming it. But, Clara spoke 11 words in the month of June, Evelyn counted. Not obsessively, not making a record of it, but she was aware of each one the way you're aware of the first few drops of rain after a long dry spell. They came in no particular order and with no predictable timing. Yes and no appeared first, deployed with precision and economical frequency. Then hungry, once at the supper table when Caleb had misjudged how long the stew needed and it wasn't ready at the usual hour. Then there, pointing at the garden, directing Evelyn's attention to a beetle she'd found on the bean plants, dark blue-green and iridescent, and apparently very significant. "That's a ground beetle," Evelyn said. "They eat other insects. It's a good one to have." Clara looked at the beetle, then at Evelyn, then back at the beetle. "Mine," she said, which was word number 8. "You can't keep a beetle, Clara." A look of profound disagreement. "It needs to stay in the garden," Evelyn said. "It's doing important work." Clara considered this. She looked at the beetle for another long moment, then very deliberately set a small stone on either side of it, marking the location, and stood up and walked away. The beetle was hers. It just lived in the garden. Evelyn did not tell Caleb about this because she was fairly sure he'd laugh, and she thought Clara's beetle logic was actually quite coherent. Words 9 through 11 came together, which felt significant. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon, and Evelyn was mending one of Clara's dresses, the most repaired one, which had developed a new tear at the hem, sitting in the doorway of the house to catch the last of the evening light. Clara came and sat beside her, uninvited, and watched her hands for a while. "Can I learn?" she said. 3 words, a complete sentence, a direct question. Evelyn kept her reaction off her face. "Yes," she said. "Hold out your hands." She showed Clara how to thread a needle, which took several tries and ended in a frustrated sound from Clara that was almost a word of a different kind. She showed her the basic running stitch, the way you kept the tension even, how you pulled through but not too far. Clara's first attempts were uneven and went slightly sideways, but she kept at it with that ferocious concentration she brought to anything she decided was worth doing. They sat in the doorway until the light was gone, mending the dress together, and didn't talk except for Evelyn's occasional quiet directions and Clara's slight adjustments in response. And it was one of the most comfortable hours Evelyn could remember in a long time. But she was not comfortable in town. This was something she understood by the end of the first month, though she'd felt it earlier. Harrow Creek was small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, and large enough that there were several women with both the time and inclination to make other people's business their particular project. Chief among these was a woman named Bertrice Halloway, wife of the man who ran the feed store, a tall, thin person with a gift for the kind of comment that required no direct accusation, but left you very clear on what was being implied. Evelyn encountered her first on the supply run in late June. She was with Caleb at the general store, waiting while he settled his account and gathered what was on the list she'd made, and Bertrice Halloway appeared at her elbow with the particular suddenness of a woman who has been watching for an opportunity. "Mrs. Mercer," she said. She knew Evelyn's name, which meant she'd been paying attention. "I've heard you've been staying out at the Boone place." "I have," Evelyn said. "As what, exactly?" The question had a surface of genuine curiosity and an underside of something considerably less friendly. Evelyn recognized both layers without difficulty. She'd been a respectable woman in Cincinnati, and she knew exactly the register Bertrice Halloway was operating in. "I help with the household," Evelyn said, "and with Clara." Bertrice Halloway's gaze moved to where Caleb was at the counter, then back to Evelyn. "And you arrived here to marry Douglas Crane." "I arrived here expecting to," Evelyn said. "Douglas Crane had other plans." "So you've just stayed on?" "At a widower's ranch. In the room off the kitchen," Evelyn said very precisely, "which has a door that locks." Bertrice Halloway's mouth compressed. "I'm sure it does," she said. "Is there something I can help you with, Mrs. Halloway?" "I was just expressing an interest," the woman said. "People talk, you know, in a small town." "I'm sure they do," Evelyn said. "I hope they find something more interesting to say eventually." She moved away before Bertrice Halloway could respond, which was the correct move. Engaging further would have given the conversation weight it didn't deserve. And Evelyn had enough experience with this particular variety of social combat to know that the fastest way to lose it was to take it seriously. But it stayed with her. Not the specific words, those were nothing, but the awareness they carried, which was that her presence at the Boone spread was notable, was being observed, and had the potential to cause a kind of trouble she hadn't fully calculated. She didn't say anything to Caleb about it on the way back. She looked at the country instead and let the wind off the sage flats clear her head. She mentioned it to him that evening after Clara was in bed. "Bertrice Halloway introduced herself today," she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression suggested he was familiar with the species. "What did she say?" "Wanted to know what I was doing here. Implied that a woman staying at a widower's ranch without a formal arrangement was a matter of community interest." He was quiet for a moment. "She say that directly?" "She implied it in the way people do when they want the effect without the accountability." He rubbed the back of his neck. "She'll say it more directly eventually. She always does." "I know," Evelyn said. "I wanted you to know it was coming so you weren't caught off guard." He looked at her steadily. "Does it bother you? What she's implying?" "The implication is inaccurate," Evelyn said. "So no. But it may create complications for you. And for Clara." "Let me worry about my complications," he said. "I'm not trying to manage you," she said. "I'm telling you because you have a right to know what's being said." He was quiet again, the kind of quiet that meant he was actually thinking rather than avoiding. "The people in this town who matter," he said, "are mostly sensible. Bertrice Halloway and the 3 or 4 women who follow her lead are," he seemed to pick the word carefully, "a specific problem, not the whole town." "That's reassuring," she said. "Don't be sarcastic." "I wasn't," she said, and meant it. He looked at her again with that careful look, recalibrating something. "All right," he said. "I know the names of 2 or 3 people she'll have already spoken to. I'll talk to them. You don't have to defend me. I'm not defending you, he said. I'm correcting misinformation. There's a difference. She thought about that for a moment. Yes, she said. There is. Hot. July came in hot and stayed that way, baking the Nevada flats into a kind of shimmering stillness during the afternoon hours that made any outdoor work before 4 o'clock miserable, and any work after sunset necessary to compensate. Caleb pushed the harder ranch work to the early mornings and the evenings. Evelyn adapted her routines accordingly, doing the cooking and kitchen work in the cooler parts of the day, and taking the afternoon for tasks that could be done in shade, mending, preserving. The steady accumulation of the work that kept a household functional. Clara, freed from the tyranny of any particular schedule, became something of an ambient presence. She appeared where she wanted, departed without announcement, and was generally somewhere within range without being underfoot. She had decided that the barn cat, a scarred, unsentimental orange animal named Rust, who had tolerated no one's company for the 4 years he'd lived at the ranch, was her particular charge, a decision Rust appeared to resent until suddenly he didn't, at which point he permitted Clara to carry him around like a somewhat aggressive furry parcel. Rust doesn't usually allow that, Caleb said one morning, watching his daughter carry the cat out of the barn. Clara is persistent, Evelyn said. She gets that from her mother, he said, and went to saddle his horse before the heat came up. Evelyn stood with that sentence for a moment. He'd mentioned his wife twice now, and both times it had been in the past tense but without the careful avoidance she'd noticed in the first weeks. Progress, maybe, or just the natural way of things when time kept moving whether or not you were ready. She went to make bread. The trouble that Bertrice Halloway had been building toward arrived in the form of Reverend. Well, he called himself Reverend, though Evelyn had her doubts. Amos Cleet, who served as the closest thing Harrow Creek had to moral authority, and who appeared at the Boone's spread on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-July with his hat in his hands and an expression of practiced concern. Evelyn was in the garden when she saw the wagon coming up the track. She recognized Cleet from town. Tall, gray-haired, the kind of man who had learned to make his disapproval feel like concern for your own welfare, which was the most effective kind. Caleb came around from the barn when he heard the wagon. Cleet climbed down and shook Caleb's hand and said he'd just come by to check in, which was such an obvious evasion of his actual purpose that Evelyn, watching from the garden, had to admire the smoothness of it. She stayed where she was. She was not going to make this easier by retreating into the house. "I've heard you've had some help out here," Cleet said after the preliminary exchange. "Mrs. Mercer's been helping with the household and my daughter," Caleb said. His voice was level. He knew why Cleet was here. "A widower," Cleet said carefully, "and a single woman living under the same roof." "She has a room off the kitchen," Caleb said. "It's a straightforward working arrangement." "I'm sure it is," Cleet said, in the tone that meant he wasn't sure at all. "But you know how people talk, Caleb, and it's not just for your reputation I'm thinking of. It's for Miss Clara." This was the clever move. Evelyn acknowledged it as she pulled a weed with perhaps more force than necessary. Using the child was clever because it was the place Caleb couldn't be dismissive. She heard the shift in Caleb's silence from the garden, a tighter quality, the silence of a man deciding something. "Clara hasn't spoken in 3 years, Amos," Caleb said. "She started speaking again in June." A pause. "Mrs. Mercer has done more for my daughter in 6 weeks than I've been able to manage in 3 years of trying," Caleb said. "That's not a slight against me. I've tried, but I'm one person and I run a ranch and there are limits to what one person can do." His voice was still level, but there was an edge in it now, something that hadn't been there before. "The arrangement is respectable. It is what I say it is, and I'd be obliged if you'd take that back to whoever sent you here." Another pause, longer. "Nobody sent me," Cleet said, though the slight shift in his voice said otherwise. "Then I'm glad you came on your own account," Caleb said. "Would you like some water before you go?" Cleet took the water and left, and Caleb came to the garden after the wagon had gone down the track and stood for a moment not saying anything. "Thank you," Evelyn said. "I meant what I said," he said, "about Clara." "I know you did." He looked at the garden, at the bean plants staked and climbing, at the rows that had been salvaged from neglect. "She said something to me last night," he said. "Clara." Evelyn waited. "She said—" He stopped. He was not a man who expressed things easily, she'd learned, and emotional things especially required the kind of silence he gave to difficult fence lines. She said she didn't want you to leave. She said that to you. She said 4 words. Don't let her go. His voice was steady, but just barely. First 4-word sentence she's put together in 3 years. Evelyn looked at the bean plants for a long time without seeing them. Caleb, she said. I'm not asking anything, he said quickly. I'm just telling you what she said. I understand. She's 6 years old and she... He stopped again. I can't make promises on her behalf. I know that. But I thought you should know. Evelyn nodded. She pressed the soil around the base of a bean plant that didn't need pressing. The afternoon heat lay over everything, and somewhere out on the flats a hawk was circling in a thermal, very high and very patient. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Not right now. Right now, he said. It's the honest answer, she said. I could tell you I'm staying indefinitely, but I don't know that yet. What I know is that I'm here now, and I'm not leaving. He was quiet for a moment. Fair, he said, which was what he said when he accepted something he maybe hadn't wanted to hear. August came and the ranch found its rhythm, which was not an easy rhythm or a comfortable one, but had the quality of sustainability. The sense that the daily work was building something rather than merely consuming itself. The cattle were doing better than they had the previous year. Caleb said so one evening with the careful understatement of a man who had learned not to count on good news until it was absolutely confirmed. But Evelyn could see it in the ease with which he sat at the table, the slightly less compressed quality of his shoulders. The kitchen garden was producing steadily now. Evelyn put up preserves, 8 jars of green beans, 11 of tomatoes when they came in, a small batch of pepper relish from the few hot peppers that had made it through the heat. She'd found a second canning pot in the back of the pantry, behind a collection of tools whose purpose she'd had to ask Caleb about. And the kitchen in August smelled of hot glass and brine and the particular sweet, sharp scent of tomatoes cooked down. Clara had opinions about the canning process. She was opposed to certain steps and devoted to others, and had developed a specific role in the procedure that nobody had assigned her but which she had assigned herself. She checked the seals. Each finished jar, when it cooled, Clara pressed the lid with one finger and listened for the right sound, and if the seal held, she set it on the shelf with a satisfaction that Evelyn recognized as the satisfaction of competence. If the seal didn't hold, which happened twice, she brought it back to Evelyn without a word, but with an expression that said she was taking this personally. She's meticulous, Evelyn told Caleb. Her mother was, he said. He said it easily this time, without the slight withdrawal that had marked the earlier mentions. Evelyn noticed but didn't comment. What was her name? She asked, which she hadn't asked before. Ruth, he said, Ruth Annalise. She grew up in Utah, came out here because her family had land near the river and the land didn't turn out to be what they'd thought, and she married me more or less as an alternative to going back east. He was talking to the middle distance, somewhere above the stove. She was stubborn and difficult, and she knew her own mind about everything, and she would have argued with you about the pepper relish. The pepper relish is very good, Evelyn said. She would have said it needed more vinegar. The corner of his mouth moved. She was usually right about things like that. I can add more vinegar next time. Don't, he said. It's fine as it is. She understood what he meant, and the understanding settled between them quietly, like something that had been waiting to be said and was satisfied now that it had been acknowledged. The thing that arrived in late August wasn't a person or a letter or a direct confrontation. It was a notice tacked to the board outside the general store in Harrow Creek, which Evelyn saw on a supply run while Caleb was at the feed store. It was a notice of a community meeting called for the first Friday of September to discuss matters of moral concern affecting the reputation of the Harrow Creek community. It was signed by Bertrice Halloway and 4 other names she recognized from town, and while it didn't name the Boone spread directly, it didn't need to. She read it twice. She didn't take it down. She went to find Caleb. He read it without expression, which was not the same as reading it without reaction. She'd learned the difference. His jaw set slightly. He folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. Who else do you think has seen this? She said. Half the town by now. He looked at the board where it had been, as if the absence of the notice still had the shape of it. Bertrice has been building to something. This is it. I could go, Evelyn said. Not I should go, just I could. He looked at her sharply. Not forever, she said. I mean to the meeting. I could attend. Address it directly. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. But walking away from it suggests there's something to walk away from. And there isn't. She looked at him steadily. Is there? He held her gaze. No, he said. There isn't. Then we go to the meeting. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him work through it, the instinct to handle his own problems alone against the practical evidence that this was not only his problem, and that standing alone in front of a room of skeptical people was less effective than standing together. Together, she said. Together, he said, like it was a word he was trying out. They walked back to the wagon and drove home through the late afternoon, and Clara was on the fence watching for them as she always was when they'd been to town, and when the wagon came through the gate, she jumped down and ran to meet them, and Caleb caught her up in one arm without breaking stride, and she settled against his shoulder and looked at Evelyn over it with those steady blue eyes. Whatever Harrow Creek thought of the arrangement, Evelyn thought, this was what the arrangement actually was. A man carrying his daughter through the late Nevada light, and Evelyn walking beside them, and the house waiting with its fixed latches and its stocked pantry, and the smell of pepper relish still faint in the air, patient and imperfect, and entirely real. The Friday of the meeting came on a cool evening for September, the air finally losing the brutal edge of summer and carrying instead that particular smell of approaching fall that was half dust and half something older. Evelyn dressed carefully, not to impress but to be taken seriously, which required different choices. Her best traveling dress, pressed, her hair arranged simply. She was not going to that room looking like someone with something to apologize for. Caleb wore his good shirt and his hat and said nothing about any of it. They left Clara with the neighbor woman, Ada Parrish, who lived 4 miles north and had 3 children of her own, and a no-nonsense disposition that Clara seemed to find either comforting or at least acceptable, which was the best you could expect. Clara had looked at Evelyn when they left with an expression that was not accusatory, but was very specifically watchful, the way she looked when she was not entirely sure something would go right. We'll be back before dark, Evelyn told her. Clara looked at her. I promise, she said, which was not a word she used lightly. The meeting was held in the back room of the general store, which had a dozen chairs and a low ceiling and smelled of sawdust and dry goods. Bertrice Halloway was there with her husband, a compact, silent man named Earl, who appeared to have no opinion about anything his wife did and had possibly made peace with this state. 4 or 5 other couples. Amos Cleet, who had clearly been invited to lend the proceedings a formal quality. There were also, which Evelyn hadn't expected, a handful of people who seemed to be present more out of curiosity or something like sympathy than support for Bertrice Halloway's position. Ada Parrish's husband, a rancher named Tom, who shook Caleb's hand. A woman named Dora Seelig from the east end of town who taught at the small schoolhouse and who looked at Evelyn with the particular alert attention of someone who had recognized a colleague. The meeting was more awkward than hostile. Bertrice Halloway was a skilled enough social operator to have made the notice vague enough to be defensible, which meant she had to let the proceedings develop rather than arriving with direct accusations. And Amos Cleet seemed to have reconsidered his role after his visit to the ranch, and was notably less zealous than Bertrice had probably hoped. It was Dora Seelig who changed the tenor of it, and she did it with the efficiency of a woman who had been in enough school board meetings to know how to redirect a conversation. What I'd like to know, Dora said, from the back of the room, after Bertrice had made several careful implications about community standards and the welfare of children in households of uncertain arrangement, is whether anyone in this room has actually spoken to the child. A pause. Clara Boone is 6 years old, Dora said. She lost her mother at 3, and she spent the next 3 years not speaking to anyone. I've been teaching school here for 8 years, and I've never been able to reach her. She looked at Evelyn. Mrs. Mercer has been at that ranch 6 weeks, and the girl is talking. Silence. I'm interested in the welfare of children, Dora said. That seems like welfare. Bertrice Halloway made a sound that was not quite a rebuttal. Caleb spoke from beside Evelyn, and his voice in the low-ceilinged room was quiet, but had that quality she'd noticed in him. The quality of something that didn't need to be loud to carry weight. Mrs. Mercer came to Harrow Creek in difficult circumstances. She has conducted herself without a single occasion for criticism that I've witnessed, which is every day for 6 weeks. She has put time and care and real effort into my household and my daughter. What has been implied tonight about her character is wrong. I'd like that to be the last time it's implied. He said it without anger. That was the thing, without defensiveness or heat, just as a statement of fact that he expected to be received as such. Earl Halloway, who had said nothing the entire meeting, cleared his throat and said, "Well, I think that's pretty clear." His wife looked at him as though he'd grown a second head. "Let's call it done," Tom Parrish said. It wasn't entirely done. Bertram Halloway would not consider it done for some time yet, and there would be other mornings in town when Evelyn felt eyes on her back and heard the stopped conversation. But the meeting itself broke up with a lack of drama that Bertram had clearly not intended, and people drifted out into the cool September night, and Dora Seelig stopped Evelyn near the door. "Are you a teacher?" she asked. "I was," Evelyn said. "I have a certificate, Cincinnati." "I could use help at the schoolhouse," Dora said. "2 days a week if you could manage it. Pay is modest." Evelyn looked at her. "How modest?" "Genuinely modest," Dora said without apology. "But it's honest work." "Yes," Evelyn said. "I'll come." They drove home in the dark, the Nevada sky enormous above them, and Caleb drove and didn't say much, but there was something different in the silence. Not the careful silence of the early weeks, but something more settled, as if the evening had confirmed a thing that had been waiting to be confirmed. "Dora Seelig offered me teaching work," she said, 2 days a week. "She's a good woman," he said. I accepted. "All right, I wanted to tell you," she said, "in case it affects the household schedule. We'll manage." They drove a mile in the good dark. "Evelyn," he said. He hadn't used her first name before. She noted it without comment. "Yes." "What I said in there," he said, "about your character, I meant it." "I know you did," she said. "I'm not—" He paused. "I'm not good at saying things like that, directly." "I noticed," she said. Something in his exhale that might have been a laugh, barely. "I'll work on it," he said. "You're doing fine," she said, and looked at the stars over Nevada, enormous and cold and unerring in all the right ways, and felt for the first time in a long time that she was exactly where she had put herself on purpose, which was not a thing she'd been able to say in a very long time. Clara was asleep at Ada Parrish's when they arrived, small and fair-haired and entirely unconscious on the guest bed, and Caleb carried her to the wagon and all the way home and up to the loft without waking her, the way a man carries something irreplaceable, which was what she was. And Evelyn stood at the bottom of the loft ladder and listened to the quiet sounds of him settling his daughter into her bed. And the ranch around them was dark and still, and the stars outside the window were the same stars she'd watched from the platform at Harrow Creek Station 2 months ago, when she'd had $18 and a broken promise and nothing else, and they looked entirely different now. She went to her room and closed the door that locked and lay down on her narrow bed and did not sleep immediately, because there were things moving in her that needed a while to settle, and she let them move without trying to name them, and eventually the coyotes out on the flat started up their conversation with the dark, and the dark answered them, and she slept. The letter arrived on a Thursday in October, tucked between a seed catalog and a bill of sale from the feed store, and Evelyn almost missed it entirely because she was carrying the mail inside, while simultaneously managing a pot that was threatening to boil over and keeping one eye on Clara, who had climbed onto the fence rail to observe Caleb working a young horse in the corral and was in genuine danger of toppling off. "Clara, sit down properly or get off the fence," she said, and set the mail on the kitchen table without looking at it, and pulled the pot off the heat, and went to the door to confirm that Clara had in fact adjusted her position, which she had, though with an expression that communicated her opinion of the instruction. It was a full 20 minutes before she came back to the table and picked up the mail, and another minute before she saw the return address on the third envelope, the law offices of Whitmore and Crane, Cincinnati, Ohio. She sat down. She had not heard from Cincinnati in 4 months. She had, if she was honest with herself, stopped expecting to. The life she'd left there had closed over her departure like water over a stone, quickly, completely, without much visible disturbance. She'd had no particular reason to think anyone in Cincinnati was thinking about Evelyn Mercer. The letter was 2 pages, written in the precise formal hand of a man paid to be precise. It was from an attorney named Harlan Whitmore, and it said, in language that took a paragraph to say what could have been said in 2 sentences, that the matter of the estate of her late uncle, Percival Mercer, which had been contested following certain irregularities in the handling of funds by the executor, had been resolved in her favor. The executor, a man named Foster, whose name she remembered with a specific and cold clarity, had been found to have defrauded multiple beneficiaries. A settlement had been reached. Her share, after legal fees, amounted to $940. $940. She read the letter twice. Then she set it down on the table and looked at the window and the October sky outside it, which was doing nothing in particular, just being blue, with the specific Nevada blue of fall, sharp and very clean. $940 was not a fortune, but it was, in the context of her life for the past 2 years, an astronomical sum. It was enough to return to Cincinnati and establish herself, enough to rent decent rooms, to buy into a small teaching arrangement, to rebuild the respectable middle-class life she'd been living before Foster's fraud had taken it apart. She could go back. That was the fact that sat in the middle of the letter like a weight. She could go back. The thing that had driven her to answer Douglas Crane's advertisement, the bare desperation of no other options, was gone. She had an option now, a real one. She had money and a professional background and the possibility of resuming a life that looked, from the outside, like stability. She folded the letter very carefully along its original creases and put it in her coat pocket. Then she went and started supper as if nothing had happened, because Clara would be in from the fence soon and Caleb would be in from the corral, and they would both be hungry, and she needed time to think before she said anything to anyone. She thought about it for 3 days before she told him. Those 3 days were not easy days. She went about the ranch work and the teaching days and the evenings by the stove with a surface entirely normal and an interior that was in the kind of quiet chaos that doesn't show because all the noise is happening in a place nobody else can see. She made bread and helped Clara with the stitching she'd been learning and graded the reading assignments from Dora Selig's class and lay awake at night listening to the Nevada dark and did not sleep well. The problem was not that she didn't know what she wanted. The problem, which she kept arriving at from different directions and finding the same shape each time, was that she didn't fully trust what she wanted. She'd made large decisions based on want before, had wanted to believe in Douglas Crane's letters, had wanted to believe that Foster was trustworthy with the estate, and those wants had led her in both cases to places she hadn't intended. She had some reason to be skeptical of her own desires. She wanted to stay. She was nearly certain she wanted to stay. But the wanting felt tangled up in things that she couldn't cleanly separate. The relief of not being precarious, the satisfaction of the work, the slow, specific pleasure of Clara's voice growing stronger, the evenings with Caleb that had become something she valued without having a precise name for it. How much of the wanting to stay was genuinely about this place and these people, and how much of it was just the wanting not to go through another upheaval? She wasn't sure, and the unsureness nagged at her. On the third evening, when Clara was in the loft and the kitchen had gone quiet, she put the letter on the table between them. Caleb looked at it without touching it, then at her. "A letter from Cincinnati," she said, "from a lawyer. The man who defrauded me was prosecuted. I'm being given back part of what was taken." He was still looking at her, not the letter. $940, she said. A long silence. Outside, the wind moved through the scrub, and the horses shifted in the barn. "That's good news," he said, carefully. "Yes," she said. "It means you have options." "It means I have options," she agreed. He looked at the table now, not at her. The particular side of his face she could see had gone very neutral, which she'd learned was not the absence of feeling, but the active management of it. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking I should tell you," she said, "before I think it through to a conclusion, because it affects you and Clara, and you have a right to know. I'm not going to tell you what to do, Evelyn." "I know that," she said. "That's not why I'm telling you." He looked at her directly then. The lamp between them was low, and the light it cast was warm and uneven, and made the kitchen look, as it often did at this hour, like something from a painting, not idealized, just particular. The crack she'd patched near the window, the preserves on the shelf, the mended curtain, the small specific evidence of a life being lived in a place. "What does it feel like?" he said. She didn't expect the question. What? The letter. What does it feel like when you read it? She considered being evasive. She didn't. Like a door I thought was closed turned out to be open, she said, and I'm not sure if I want to go through it. Why not? Because of what I'd be leaving, she said. She held his gaze. Which I'm telling you not to put pressure on you, but because you asked, and I'm trying to be honest. He was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet she knew now, the working through kind. My wife, he said, and stopped. Started again. Ruth made a choice to stay out here. She had options too when she married me. Her family had come west and things hadn't gone right, and she chose me partly because there wasn't much else to choose. I knew that. His voice was even, but there was something it was holding. And she was happy here. I think she was. But I never stopped wondering if she'd stayed because she wanted to or because she didn't have another way out. Evelyn said nothing. I don't want... He stopped. I wouldn't want someone to stay here out of that. I know, she said. That's partly why I'm not sure. He nodded, slowly. How much time do you have to decide? About the money? Whitmore wants a response within 30 days. Then take the 30 days, he said. Don't decide tonight. She looked at the letter on the table between them. All right, she said. He stood up and went to check the horses, as he did every night before bed, and she sat with the letter in the quiet kitchen and the sound of Clara breathing in the loft above her, steady and deep, the sound of a child sleeping without nightmares, and she thought about doors. She had been teaching at Dora Selig's schoolhouse for 6 weeks by then, 2 days a week, and the work had settled into her the way good work does. Not glamorous, not without its frustrations, but right in a way she recognized from deep in her spine. The children were a mixed group, ages 6 to 12, in the single-room schoolhouse on the east side of town, and they had the range of abilities and attitudes she remembered from Cincinnati. The full human spectrum from the boy who read 3 grades ahead and was bored and made it everyone's problem to the girl in the back who was 3 grades behind and was trying not to let anyone see how hard she was working. She liked them. She was not, she knew, the kind of teacher who floated above the classroom dispensing wisdom. She was the kind who got impatient with excuses and didn't always modulate her tone when something frustrated her and occasionally ran the last 10 minutes longer than she should because she was in the middle of something. But she was also the kind who stayed after when a child needed help and noticed when something at home was making school hard and remembered what each student was working on from one lesson to the next. Dora had noticed. "You're good at this," she said one afternoon when the children had gone. "I know," Evelyn said, which wasn't vanity but honesty, and Dora recognized the difference. "Is it something you've considered doing here?" Dora said. "Long term?" "I've considered many things," Evelyn said, which was also true. Dora was quiet for a moment, straightening the readers on the shelf with the methodical care of a woman who had arranged the same shelf 1,000 times. "I know about the letter," she said. She looked at Evelyn's expression and added, "Harrow Creek is a small town. Caleb mentioned it to Tom Parrish, and Tom mentioned it to his wife." "Good Lord," Evelyn said. "I know," Dora said, without apology. "The thing is, and I'm saying this as someone who's been here 8 years and has watched this place from inside, if you're thinking about whether there's something worthwhile here to stay for, there is. The school needs you. The children are better with 2 of us." She paused. "But that's a practical argument, and you'll make whatever decision you make on whatever grounds you make it." "You're very careful not to influence me," Evelyn said. "I'm trying," Dora said. "I'm not sure I'm succeeding." "You're not," Evelyn said. "But I don't mind." So Clara found out in the way children find out things they haven't been told, through the specific attention they pay to adult behavior when adults think they're not watching. It was a Saturday. Evelyn had come back from town with the week's supplies and set them on the kitchen table and was putting things away. And Clara was at the table with a piece of cloth she'd been hemming, working slowly and carefully, and the letter was visible at the edge of the table where Evelyn had left it that morning after reading it again. Clara looked at it. She looked at it for a while, and then she looked at Evelyn. "Are you going?" she said. Evelyn stopped. She turned around. Clara was looking at her with those eyes that saw too much, that always had. The eyes of a child who had been watching adults carefully for 3 years for any sign of impending loss. who had learned to read the small behavioral signals that preceded departure. "I don't know yet," Evelyn said, because she wasn't going to lie to her. Something in Clara's face went tight and still. She looked back down at her hemming. "Clara," Evelyn said. "It's fine," Clara said. The first time she'd ever used that particular word, and she used it in exactly the way adults used it when things were not fine, with the precise flatness of managed feeling. "It's not fine," Evelyn said, "and you don't have to pretend it is." Clara's needle went in and out of the cloth. Her jaw was set. "I haven't decided yet," Evelyn said. "That's the truth. I'm still working through it." "Everyone always goes," Clara said, to the cloth, not to Evelyn. "Clara, Mama went, and then you'll go." Evelyn pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Clara kept her eyes on the hemming, but the needle had slowed. "Your mama didn't want to go," Evelyn said. "That wasn't a choice." "But you can choose, and you're still maybe going." She had no answer to that. That wouldn't be either a promise she wasn't sure she could keep or a comfort that was too easy to be real. She sat with the weight of it for a moment. "You're right," she said. Clara looked up, surprised. Whatever she'd expected, it wasn't that. "You're right that I can choose, and I'm still not sure," Evelyn said. "And I know that's hard to sit with. I know it feels like the same thing. It isn't, but I understand why it feels that way." She leaned forward slightly. "What I can tell you is that whatever I decide, it won't be because I don't care about you. Those two things are separate." Clara looked at her. The needle was completely still. "I know that's not what you want to hear," Evelyn said. "What you want to hear is that I'm staying. I understand that." She held the girl's gaze. "I'm not going to tell you something that isn't true just because it would feel better right now." A long moment. Clara looked down at her hemming, looked up again. "What would make you stay?" she said. Evelyn sat back very slightly. It was such a precisely aimed question, so characteristic of Clara, who had always been more strategic than she appeared, who approached problems as if they had solutions you could find if you looked at them directly. "A lot of things," Evelyn said. "I'm thinking about all of them." "Is one of them us?" Clara said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "One of them is you and your father. That's true." Clara looked at the letter on the edge of the table. She looked at Evelyn. Then she picked up her needle and went back to the hemming, but the set of her shoulders had changed slightly, some of the tightness gone. Not because she was satisfied, Evelyn thought, but because she'd gotten an honest answer in honesty, even when it wasn't what you wanted, was something you could do something with. The conversation with Caleb came on a night in late October, unexpected, not the way Evelyn had been planning it. She'd been planning a composed discussion of the relevant factors, organized and presented clearly, because that was how she approached most difficult things. What actually happened was that she came in from checking the kitchen garden at dusk and found Caleb at the table with a piece of paper he was writing on, and something in the bent quality of his concentration made her stop in the doorway. "What are you writing?" she said. He looked up. For a moment she thought he'd put the paper away. He didn't. "A letter," he said. "To who?" "You," he said. She came to the table and sat down. He didn't put the letter away or turn it over. That was notable. "I had a whole conversation rehearsed," he said, "in my head. I started it probably 20 times in the last 2 weeks. But every time I got to the actual saying of it, I couldn't." He stopped. He looked at the letter. "Writing it out is easier. Can I read it?" she said. He slid it across the table. His handwriting was the same plain, deliberate hand she'd seen in the occasional note he left about ranch matters. Nothing ornate, nothing wasted. The letter was half a page. It said, without preamble, "Evelyn, I have been trying to say something and failing at it for several weeks now. I'm going to try this way instead. What you have done here is not small. The house is different, and Clara is different, and I am, I think, different, and none of that would have happened without you. I don't know what you're going to decide about Cincinnati, and I'm not going to try to tell you. What I want you to know is that if you stayed, it wouldn't be out of my need. It would be because there's something here that's worth staying for. I think you know what I mean by that. If I'm wrong, disregard this. Caleb." She read it twice. She set it on the table. Outside the window, the Nevada dark was coming in, the stars appearing one by one in the east. The particular vast, unhurried sky of this place that she'd been watching for nearly 5 months now, and that still had the capacity to stop her. "You're not wrong," she said. He looked at her. "About what you mean," she said. "You're not wrong." He was very still. "But," he said, because there was clearly a but, and he was reading it in her face. "I need you to understand why I'm uncertain," she said. "It's not about you or Clara or the ranch. It's—" She looked for the words that were actually right and not just easy. "I made a choice once to come west because I had no options, and that was the right choice in the end, even though the reasons for it were wrong. If I stay now, I want to stay because I'm choosing to, not because I'm afraid of what going back would feel like, and I'm not fully sure yet which one of those things it is." He looked at her for a long time. "How would you know the difference?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "I'm still trying to figure that out." He nodded. He picked up his letter and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, which she thought was interesting, not throwing it away, not pretending he hadn't written it. "Take the time you need," he said. "You keep saying that," she said. "Because I keep meaning it," he said. The telegram arrived on a Wednesday, 11 days before Whitmore's deadline. It was from her former colleague in Cincinnati, a woman named Helen Goss, who had taught alongside her for 3 years and was one of the few people in the city Evelyn trusted without qualification. Helen's telegrams were always expensive and therefore short, and this one said only, "Position open at Walnut Street School. Yours if you want it. Start January. Letter to follow. H." Evelyn held the telegram in the post office and read it 3 times, and then walked to the window that looked out at the main street of Harrow Creek, which was doing its ordinary Thursday business. A wagon from the parish ranch, 2 men outside the feed store, a woman Evelyn recognized from the schoolhouse, parents collecting her children from Dora's morning session. The Walnut Street School was where Evelyn had wanted to teach before everything with Foster had gone wrong. It was a good school, well-funded, with a proper salary and a real library and children whose families were, on the whole, capable of supporting the work of education. It was everything she'd been building toward before her life had been upended. She folded the telegram and put it in her pocket with the letter from Whitmore, and they sat there together like the 2 sides of a scale. She told no one about the telegram. Not immediately. She needed to think about it without the presence of people she cared about, affecting the texture of the thinking, which was the thing she'd been trying to do for weeks and finding increasingly difficult. She drove herself out to the edge of the south pasture that Saturday, where the fence line ran along a low ridge, and the land opened up beyond it into the wide basin that she'd been looking at since May. She sat on the fence rail, the rail that Caleb had repaired after the calf incident, solid now under her, and she looked at the basin and she let herself think as clearly as she could about what she actually wanted. The Walnut Street position. The $940. Helen's voice at the end of a letter, reliable and known. Cincinnati winters that were brutal in a city way, with slush and coal smoke, but that had the compensating grace of libraries and concert halls and the specific pleasure of urban life she'd not known she missed until it was gone. She looked at the basin. She thought about the morning she'd watched Clara check the jar seals, pressing each lid with that serious, focused finger. She thought about Caleb's letter, the plain handwriting, something here worth staying for. She thought about Dora Selig's schoolhouse, the boy who read 3 grades ahead, the girl trying not to let anyone see her working. She thought about the kitchen at 6 in the morning with the stove warming and the particular smell of coffee and Nevada sage coming through the window. She thought about what she'd said to Caleb. "I want to stay because I'm choosing to, not because I'm afraid of what going back would feel like." She sat with that. The wind off the south pasture was cold and very clean, and the cattle she could hear on the far side of the ridge were producing that low sound they made in the late afternoon, the settling sound, the sound of a herd coming to rest, and something in her chest that had been held taut for weeks, since the Whitmore letter, since the telegram, since the 30 days began their count, released. Not dramatically, not in the way of things in stories where the realization comes with light and music, just quietly, like a knot being worked loose by patient fingers until it gives. She was not staying because she was afraid of Cincinnati. She knew what Cincinnati looked like. She'd lived it for years, knew its texture and its rhythms, knew exactly the life that waited for her there. And she was sitting on a fence rail in Nevada in October wind, choosing not to go back to it. That was a choice, a real one. She climbed down from the fence and walked back to the wagon and drove home through the early dark. She told Caleb that evening. Clara was in the loft with Russ the cat, who had taken to sleeping at the foot of her bed with the resigned affection of an animal who has been outmaneuvered by a 6-year-old and is making the best of it. She set the telegram on the table next to the letter from Whitmore. Caleb read both without comment. He set them down. "There's a position in Cincinnati," she said. "A good one. At a school I'd been hoping to teach at before all of this." She looked at him. "And the money is enough to go back." "I know," he said. "I'm not going back," she said. He looked at her, very carefully. The way he looked at things he was making sure were actually what they appeared to be before he depended on them. "That's a decision," he said. "Yes," she said. "Why?" he said. Not to argue, to understand. "Because I went out to the south pasture today, and I tried to think about it honestly," she said. Without you and Clara in the room making it harder to think. And when I took you both out of the equation and tried to just look at the two lives, the one here and the one in Cincinnati, I kept coming back to the same thing. Which is, the Cincinnati life is good, she said. It's a good life. Respectable, stable, comfortable. I know how to live it, and it would be fine. She looked at him steadily. But fine is not the same as right. And this is right. Even though it's hard and uncertain, and we don't have much money, and Bertrice Halloway will make pointed comments about me until one of us leaves town. She paused. This is right. He was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them flickered slightly in a draft from somewhere. I need to write to Whitmore tomorrow, she said. And to Helen. All right, he said. And I'd like to, if you think it makes sense, to formalize the arrangement, properly. She kept her voice even. Not because of Bertrice Halloway, but because it's the practical thing, and because Clara needs... Evelyn, he said. She stopped. I wrote that letter 2 weeks ago, he said. I've known what I want. I've been waiting for you to know what you want. She looked at him across the table, this careful, plain-spoken, difficult man with his worn shirt and his honest hands and his letter in his pocket that he hadn't thrown away. I know what I want, she said. He nodded. Something in his face that wasn't quite a smile but was in that direction. The way expressions move in people who've gotten out of the habit of showing them easily, the direction of it visible even when the thing itself was held back. Good, he said. And then Clara's voice came down from the loft, clear and fully present, the voice that had been growing stronger for 4 months and was now simply her voice, ordinary and real. Are you two going to talk all night? Evelyn and Caleb looked at each other. Probably, Evelyn called back. A sound from the loft. Possibly rust being rearranged. Possibly Clara being satisfied by an answer she'd been listening for. Evelyn looked at the Whitmore letter and the telegram on the table, the 2 clean pieces of paper that represented a door standing open. She picked them up and folded them together and set them aside. There was supper to finish putting away. The water pump needed a check before morning. The south pasture fence still had a section Caleb had flagged for attention. The bean plants had finished for the season, and the beds needed to be turned. There was, she thought, a great deal of work still to do. She picked up the lamp and carried it to the kitchen and started on the dishes. And from somewhere above her, the loft was quiet, with the particular quiet of a child who has gotten the answer she was listening for and is now, finally, simply asleep. The letters went out on a Monday morning, 2 of them, written the night before at the kitchen table while Caleb checked the horses and Clara slept. The one to Whitmore was brief and professional, declining the settlement disbursement timeline he'd proposed, and requesting instead that the funds be held in trust until she could make arrangements through a Nevada bank, which Dora Seelig had told her was possible and which felt like the right way to handle money she hadn't expected and didn't want to make hasty decisions about. The one to Helen was harder to write and went through 3 drafts before she had something she felt was honest without being either apologetic or falsely cheerful. Dear Helen, I'm staying in Nevada. This will surprise you, possibly disappoint you, and I understand both reactions. The position at Walnut Street is everything I would have wanted a year ago. But I found something here that I didn't anticipate and am not willing to walk away from. I hope you'll accept that as a complete explanation, because it's the most truthful one I can give. I'll write more when things are settled. Evelyn. She sealed both envelopes before she could reconsider and rode to town to post them herself in the early morning before the day's work started. And when she came back, Caleb was at the stove making a credible attempt at breakfast, and Clara was at the table watching him with the evaluating eye she turned on anyone operating in what she'd come to consider Evelyn's domain. "The eggs are going to go rubbery," Clara said. "I know how to make eggs," Caleb said. "You're letting them sit." "Clara, Evelyn says you have to keep them moving." "Evelyn isn't here right now." "I'm here now," Evelyn said from the doorway. Both of them looked at her. Caleb with a slight expression of a man relieved of a responsibility he'd accepted reluctantly. Clara with the satisfaction of someone whose point had just been proven. Evelyn hung up her coat and went to the stove. "Move over," she said. "The eggs aren't that bad," Caleb said. She looked at the pan. "Move over, Caleb." He moved over. November came in cold and serious, the way Nevada Novembers did. Not the dramatic cold of a mountain winter, but the flat, penetrating cold of the high desert. The kind that got into the walls of the house and made the kitchen the only truly warm room and caused the water in the pump to take longer each morning to run clear. Caleb spent the first 2 weeks of the month winterizing what he could, checking the barn roof, banking hay against the north wall, bringing in firewood enough to last through February if the season ran long. Evelyn helped where she could and stayed out of the way where she couldn't. She knew her limits on the ranch. She could do a great deal that she'd learned in 6 months, but the physical infrastructure of a working cattle operation was still territory where she deferred, and she'd learned early that Caleb's way of working was best supported by parallel effort rather than by following him around asking if he needed help. So while he winterized the barn, she worked on the house, caulking the windows she'd identified in the fall with proper caulking compound from the general store, replacing the kitchen curtains, which had gone thin enough that the November light came through them like paper, with heavier cloth she'd found in the dry goods section, and hemmed herself over 2 evenings. She had Clara help with the hemming, which took longer but was worth it for Clara's focused participation, and the small private pride she took in running her hand along the finished seam. "Good work," Evelyn said, the way she always said it when Clara's work was genuinely good, without embellishment. "I know," Clara said, which was new and which Evelyn found quietly delightful. The community hadn't resolved itself entirely. Bertrice Halloway's particular campaign had lost momentum after the September meeting, but it hadn't disappeared. It had merely changed character, becoming less about overt accusation and more about the kind of small, sustained social pressure that small towns were expert at. The slightly too long pause when Evelyn came into the general store, the conversations that shifted register when she approached a group of women outside the schoolhouse, the careful management of who was invited to what, and who happened to be there when certain others arrived. Evelyn managed it the only way she knew how, which was to be so consistently and practically useful that the social pressure had nowhere to attach. She was at the schoolhouse 2 days a week, and on those days was available before and after hours to any child who needed extra attention, which in Harrow Creek was several children, because the school was underfunded, and Dora was one person who'd been doing the work of 2 for years. She helped Dora organize a lending library of the school's better books, a thing that Dora had wanted to do for 3 years and hadn't had the time for. She attended the town's public meetings and sat near the front and spoke when she had something to say and was otherwise quiet. And she did all of this with a steadiness that wasn't performance, but was the natural quality of a woman who had decided where she was and had stopped hedging about it. Some people came around. Tom Parrish had been an early ally and remained one. Dora Seelig was a genuine friend by November, which Evelyn valued more than she'd expected. She'd been alone long enough that real friendship felt like something she'd half forgotten how to receive. Even Amos Cleet, who had arrived at the ranch in the summer on Bertrice Halloway's behalf, had the grace to be visibly embarrassed when he encountered Evelyn now, and had twice gone out of his way to be publicly civil to her in ways that communicated a man trying to correct an earlier mistake without having to say so directly. Bertrice Halloway herself remained. She was the fixed point around which the remaining social friction organized, and Evelyn accepted this as simply a feature of the landscape, like the cold or the wind. Not pleasant, not going away. Something to be dealt with when encountered and otherwise not spent energy on. What Evelyn hadn't fully anticipated was the effect of her decision on Caleb. He didn't change dramatically. He wasn't a man who did anything dramatically. But in the weeks after that kitchen table conversation in October, there was something different in how he moved through the house, through the day. A quality of ease that hadn't been there before. Not exactly relaxation, but the absence of a held tension she hadn't realized she'd been reading in him until it was gone. He laughed more. Not often. He was not a man constructed for frequency of laughter, but more than before, at small things, at Clara's pronouncements and at Evelyn's occasional dry observations, and the laugh itself was a different sound than the reluctant near reactions she'd gotten from him in the early months. More real, less careful. He also talked more, which was notable. Not chattily, that would never be him. But there were evenings now where the conversation over supper extended past what was necessary, where he'd say something about the cattle or the fence or a problem he was working through on the ranch, and she'd respond, and they'd be 20 minutes into a conversation before either of them noticed. Clara noticed. Clara noticed everything. "You talk a lot now," she told her father one evening. "I talk the normal amount," Caleb said. "You didn't before," Clara said. "Before what?" Clara looked at him with the expression she wore when adults asked questions she considered beneath them. "Before," she said, and went back to her hemming. Gian. The formal question of what exactly Evelyn's position was, not at the ranch, which everyone understood, but in the legal and social architecture of her life, was not one they addressed directly until December. And when they did address it, it was in the practical manner of two people who had arrived at the same destination from different directions and were now simply trying to make the journey official. It was a Sunday evening. Clara was asleep early, worn out from a day spent helping Ada Parrish's children build an elaborate and structurally questionable snow fort in the shallow snowfall that had come the previous night. Caleb and Evelyn were at the table with coffee and the account book, which they'd been working through together for the past month. Another quiet evolution, the inclusion of Evelyn in the financial planning of the ranch, which had begun practically when she'd noticed in October that the accounts were being kept in a way that made it difficult to see where the losses were coming from, and had reorganized them over a weekend with Caleb's somewhat startled permission. "The spring calving season," Caleb was saying, "if the herd stays healthy through winter, we should be looking at 20 to 25 new head, which, at current prices, puts us in significantly better shape than last year," Evelyn said. She'd run the numbers 3 times because she wanted to be sure. "If we can hold the operating costs at or below where they've been. The fence on the north line is going to need work in spring. That's not cheap." "I know. I factored it in." She turned the account book so he could see the column she'd been working. "It's still a positive outlook, not dramatic, but real." He looked at the numbers, looked at her. "You're good at this," he said. "You sound surprised every time you notice that," she said. "I'm not surprised," he said. "I'm just—" He made a slight gesture that didn't have a clear meaning. "I didn't expect it." "What did you expect?" He looked at her for a moment, and something in the look had the quality of honesty he reserved for things he'd thought through carefully. "Honestly? When you came out here with your trunk and your teaching certificate and your—" He paused. "Your very particular way of standing your ground. I expected you'd be gone in a week." "I expected I'd be gone in a week," she said. "And here we are." "And here we are," she agreed. He closed the account book. He put his coffee down. He looked at the table rather than at her for a moment, which was the specific way he looked at things he was about to say that he found difficult. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "Not because of the community," he said, "or Bertries Halloway, or because it would make things simpler, though it would, but because—" He looked up. "I think we've been building something for 6 months, and I'd like to make it what it actually is." "You want to ask me to marry you," she said. He looked at her. "I was going to get to that." "You were circling it." "I don't circle things," he said with some dignity. "Caleb, you just spent 3 sentences approaching the question from the outside." He was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them had the low, warm, uneven quality it always had at this hour, and the ranch was entirely quiet except for the wind finding the eaves. "Evelyn Mercer," he said directly, "will you marry me?" It wasn't quite a question, which seemed right. It had the quality of something he'd already thought through enough that the uncertainty wasn't about the outcome, but about the saying of it. "Yes," she said, without circling. He nodded. She wasn't sure what she'd expected, relief, maybe, or something more visible. But what she got was something quieter than that, a quality of settled rightness in his face, like a fence post that's been set properly, and you tap it and it doesn't move. Spring, he said, when the ranch work is manageable. Spring, she agreed. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. Outside, the snow from the previous night was still on the ground, thin and clean in the moonlight, and somewhere in the north pasture one of the cattle was moving, and the ordinary night sounds of the ranch moved through the walls, and the house held them in its imperfect, patched, well-attended interior, and that was that. They told Clara the next morning. She was at breakfast, working through a bowl of oatmeal, with the methodical seriousness she brought to most things, when Caleb said, "Clara, we have something to tell you." She looked up. "Evelyn and I are going to get married," he said, "in the spring." Clara looked at him, then at Evelyn, then back at the oatmeal. She picked up her spoon, put it down, looked up again. "Finally," she said. Caleb made a sound. "Clara," Evelyn said, working hard to keep her face neutral. "You've been being careful around each other for months," Clara said. "It was very obvious." "You're 6 years old," Caleb said. "I'm almost 7, Clara said, and picked up her spoon and resumed the oatmeal with the air of a person who has settled an important matter. Caleb looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Caleb. "She gets that from you," he said. "She does not," Evelyn said. They both looked at Clara, who was eating oatmeal and paying them no further attention, entirely self-contained and satisfied in the way of a person who has been right about something for quite a while and is not surprised that the world has finally caught up. The news spread through Harrow Creek with the speed that only small-town news achieved, and the town's response was, like the town itself, mixed and complicated and mostly decent when it came down to it. Dora Seelig brought a jar of preserved plums to the schoolhouse the following Tuesday and set it on Evelyn's desk without ceremony. "Congratulations," she said. "That man needed someone with a spine." "He has a spine," Evelyn said. "He does," Dora said. "But it's easier to use it when someone's standing next to you." Tom Parrish shook Caleb's hand in front of the feed store and said something brief and genuine that Caleb relayed to Evelyn later with the slightly self-conscious quality of a man not accustomed to reporting kindness done to him. Bertrice Halloway said nothing for 4 days, which was actually more unsettling than her saying something, and then on the 5th day she appeared in the general store while Evelyn was there and said, with the particular care of someone performing graciousness at some personal cost, "I heard the news. I hope it works out." She said it to the middle distance rather than directly to Evelyn, but she said it, which was something. "Thank you, Mrs. Halloway," Evelyn said. Bertrice Halloway nodded once and went to look at the dry goods with great concentration. Evelyn paid for her purchases and went outside and stood in the December light for a moment, and what she felt was not triumph or vindication, but something closer to just tiredness. The good kind. The kind that comes from a long effort that has arrived somewhere real. January was the hardest month, as January on the Nevada high desert always was. 2 weeks into the new year, a cold front came through that dropped the temperature below what Evelyn had experienced before. The kind of cold that cracked the pump housing and sent Caleb out in the middle of the night to the barn to make sure the animals were managing and kept everyone inside for 3 days running while the wind drove snow horizontally across the flats. The cattle needed checking twice daily, and the barn needed warming, and there was a problem with the water supply that Caleb spent an entire frozen morning solving with his hands in cold water and a creative arrangement of rags and tin that Evelyn watched from the barn doorway and was grateful she didn't have to do. "Your hands are going to fall off," she said. "They're not," he said. "They're blue." "It's fine." "Caleb?" "Almost done," he said. She went and got the dry towels she'd brought out in anticipation of this and had them ready when he stood up, and he dried his hands with the mechanical focus of someone trying not to feel how cold they were. And she looked at his fingers, red, cracked at the knuckles, the specific damage of hands that worked outdoors in winter, and understood in a very direct way what this life required of the people who chose it. She'd known it abstractly. January made it concrete. "Does it always get this bad?" she said. "Some years worse," he said. "Worse than this." "You get used to it." "Does that mean yes?" He looked at her over the towel. It means you get used to it, he said. She had chosen this. She was clear about that. She was also standing in a barn in January with a man whose hands were cracked from cold, very clear about what the choosing meant in practice, which was different from what it meant in theory. This was not a romantic clarity. It was the clarity of someone who had looked at a thing directly and understood it without softening. She took his hands and pressed them between hers, which was warmer for him and not entirely comfortable for her, and held them until some of the color came back. He looked at her while she did it. She didn't look up. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just fix the housing before the spring thaw so this doesn't happen again." "Yes, ma'am," he said, which was the first time he'd ever said that to her, in a tone that was about as dry as the Nevada flatlands and twice as affectionate. Clara turned 7 in February and wanted specifically a cake with jam in the middle. This was a more complex request than it appeared because the Boone's spread in February had limited supplies and jam was one of the things they were running low on pending the spring supply run. Evelyn had 3 jars of the green tomato jam she'd made in the fall, which she'd been rationing because it had turned out better than she'd expected, and she wasn't sure she could replicate it. She looked at the 3 jars for a while, and then she made the cake and put the jam in the middle, and that was that. Clara's face when she saw the cake was one of those moments that Evelyn knew she'd carry for a long time. Not because it was dramatic, but because of what was ordinary in it. A 7-year-old in her kitchen in the afternoon light, looking at a cake made specifically for her, in a home where someone had thought about what she'd want. "Is the jam in the middle?" Clara said. "Yes," Evelyn said. Clara walked around the cake once, inspecting it from all angles with the seriousness she brought to inspections. "Good," she said. Ada Parrish came with her children, and Tom Parrish came, and Doris Salad came, and the kitchen was loud in a way it hadn't been since Evelyn had arrived, crowded with people and voices, and the kind of noise that only happens when a house is genuinely being used for what houses are for. Caleb stood in the corner with his coffee and watched his daughter blow out the candles on her cake and looked, not happy exactly, because happy wasn't quite the right word for the expression on his face, which was more like a man recognizing something he'd been afraid he'd lost and finding it again in a different form than he'd expected, which is harder to name than happiness but is not smaller. Evelyn was cutting the cake when she felt his hand on her shoulder. Not dramatic, not possessive, just there, briefly. The specific communication of a man who didn't say things lightly and so sometimes said them with his hands instead. She kept cutting the cake. "Good party," he said. "It's a birthday," she said. "Not a party." "What's the difference?" "A party is optional," she said. "A birthday is not." He was quiet for a moment. "She seems happy," he said. "She is," Evelyn said. "Look at her." He looked at Clara, who was distributing slices of cake with the authority of a 7-year-old in her own home, telling Ada Parrish's oldest that he could have the corner piece because she was feeling generous, which made Ada's boy look slightly uncertain about whether generosity from Clara Boone came with conditions attached, which it probably did. "Yeah," Caleb said, quietly. Just that. Evelyn handed him a slice of cake with the piece that had the most jam in it, because he wouldn't ask for it, but he'd eat it if she gave it to him, which she'd known since October, and he took it without comment, which was its own kind of conversation. March arrived, and with it the first real signs of spring. Not warm, not by Cincinnati standards, but no longer the brutal flat cold of the deep winter, and the cattle beginning to move with less effort, and the kitchen garden bed starting to think about possibility under the last of the snow. Caleb brought in the first calf of the season on a Wednesday morning and came to the kitchen door with mud on his boots and an expression that wasn't quite a smile but was pointed in that direction. "First one," he said. "How is she?" Evelyn said. "Strong. Mother's doing fine." "Good." He stood in the doorway for a moment. He'd been doing this more lately, standing in the doorway rather than coming in immediately, as if he needed a moment to move between the outside world and the inside one. She'd started to recognize it as the transition between his 2 modes of operation, the solitary outdoor focus and the household presence, and she'd stopped trying to pull him through it faster. "Evelyn," he said. I was thinking," he looked at the door frame. "April's a decent month after the first calving push is done."
She looked up from what she was doing. "For the wedding," he said. She looked at him. "You want to move it up?" "Not move it up. We said spring." He glanced at her. "April is spring." "April is early spring." "Spring is spring," he said, with the conviction of a man who has thought about this and is not interested in subdivisions of the season.
She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. "April." Something in him settled. "Good," he said, and came inside and took his boots off and washed his hands and sat down for the breakfast that had been waiting for him for 20 minutes. Clara appeared from the loft. "Did the first calf come?" "This morning," Caleb said. "Can I see it?" After breakfast, Clara sat down and looked at her plate and then at Evelyn. "Are you going to tell her?" she said to her father. Caleb looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Clara. "Tell me what?" "About April," Clara said, with the casual certainty of a child who has been listening from the loft again. "You were supposed to be asleep," Caleb said. "I woke up," Clara said, which was technically possible and also technically not what had happened. Evelyn looked at Caleb. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. "We're moving the wedding to April," he said. "I heard," Evelyn said. "I meant I'd tell her." "I know," Evelyn said. Clara ate her breakfast with the expression of someone who has contributed to a satisfactory outcome and is not troubled by the methodology. The last real trouble before April came from a direction Evelyn hadn't fully expected, which was from inside herself. It was a night in late March. Caleb had gone out to check the herd, and Clara was asleep, and Evelyn was at the table writing a letter to Helen, which she'd been doing more regularly now, rebuilding the correspondence slowly, and Helen had written back twice in ways that were warm and only slightly bewildered. She was mid-sentence when something moved in her chest that wasn't pain but was adjacent to it, and she set down her pen and sat with it. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, in Cincinnati, in the room above the laundry, with her teaching certificate and her stolen inheritance and her $6 a week. The woman who had answered Douglas Crane's advertisement, not because she was optimistic, but because she was desperate, who had crossed 11 states on a train, eating dried apricots and writing lists of things she intended to do, because making lists was better than acknowledging the possibility that she was making the worst decision of her life. She thought about the platform at Harrow Creek, empty and cold, and Gideon Phelps's walrus mustache and his careful kindness, and the coyote that called once and fell silent. She thought about a lantern crossing the dark. None of it had gone the way she'd planned, not one part of it. Every single step from the train platform to this kitchen table had been something she hadn't expected, hadn't arranged, had simply encountered and decided about in the moment with whatever she had available. And what she had available had consistently been less than she'd have liked, less money, less certainty, less knowledge of the terrain in every sense. And yet, she looked around the kitchen, the curtains she'd hemmed, the preserves on the shelf, the patched wall by the window, the account book on the end of the table with the columns that now told a coherent story, the chair where Clara sat for every meal, pulled slightly closer to the stove than the others because Clara ran cold, the hook by the door where Caleb hung his hat. She had built this. Not alone. Nothing here was hers alone. But she had been part of building it, and it bore the marks of her presence the way a place bore the marks of anyone who'd worked it honestly. She picked up her pen and finished the sentence to Helen. "I think the thing I didn't understand before is that choosing a life isn't one decision. It's the same decision made over and over in different forms. The trick is to keep recognizing it when it comes and not look away. I'm getting better at that." She sealed the letter and went to bed and slept without difficulty, which she'd been doing since October. And the coyotes out on the flat said what they always said to the dark, and the dark replied as it always had, and the ranch slept around her, imperfect and real and entirely hers. The week before the wedding, Bertrice Halloway came to the ranch. Evelyn saw the wagon coming up the track and recognized it and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, deciding whether to feel dread or just curiosity. She settled on curiosity because it seemed more useful. She went outside when the wagon stopped. Bertrice Halloway climbed down with the precision of a woman who was performing composure. She was carrying a covered dish. "Mrs. Mercer," she said. "Mrs. Halloway," Evelyn said. A pause. Bertrice Halloway looked at the ranch, at the house, at the garden beds beginning to green at the edges, at the barn where Caleb could be heard working.
She looked at it all with the expression of someone seeing a thing they'd had a theory about and finding the theory complicated by actual evidence. "I brought a casserole," she said. "Thank you," Evelyn said. Bertrice Halloway held it out. Evelyn took it. Another pause. "I may have—" Bertrice Halloway looked at a point somewhere past Evelyn's left shoulder. "I may have formed opinions that were not—" She stopped. Started again with visible effort. "I judge quickly. It's a fault." Evelyn said nothing. This required space, not assistance. "The child looks well," Bertrice Halloway said. "I've seen her in town. She looks like herself again." She met Evelyn's eyes briefly. "That's not nothing." "No," Evelyn said. "It's not." Bertrice Halloway nodded once, the sharp, economical nod of a woman concluding a transaction that had cost her something. She climbed back onto the wagon. "Mrs. Halloway," Evelyn said. The woman stopped. "Thank you for the casserole," Evelyn said. "That was kind." Something in Bertrice Halloway's face shifted. Not softened exactly, because she was not a woman who softened easily, but adjusted. The way a thing adjusts when it's been looked at honestly and found to be other than it appeared. "Good luck on Saturday," she said, and drove away. Caleb came around from the barn and looked at the departing wagon and then at the casserole in Evelyn's hands. "Was that Bertrice Halloway?" "It was," Evelyn said. "What did she want?" "To bring a casserole," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "And to say something that was difficult for her," she said. He looked at the wagon disappearing down the track. "People are capable of surprising you," he said. "Sometimes," she said, "when the situation demands it and they're up to it." She looked at the casserole. "It might even be good." "Her cooking's decent," he said. "She's difficult, but she's a decent cook." "That's a very Caleb Boone assessment," Evelyn said. "It's accurate," he said. She laughed. Actually laughed, and the laugh surprised her with how easy it was. And Caleb looked at her with the expression she'd been seeing more of lately, the one that had nothing careful in it at all, the one that was simply him, looking at her, without management or distance or the held quality she'd spent the first months of knowing him learning to read past. 4 days, he said. 4 days, she agreed. Clara appeared at the fence. "Is that food?" she called. "Yes," Evelyn said. "What kind?" "Come and see," Evelyn said, and went inside, and Clara dropped off the fence and came at a run, and Caleb followed, and the door of the house that had been a house and was becoming, day by ordinary imperfect day, a home, closed behind them all. The morning of the wedding came in the way April mornings came to Nevada, cautiously, with a thin cold that hadn't quite decided whether to stay or go, the sky pale at the edges and deepening to blue overhead, the sage flats still carrying the night's chill. Evelyn was awake before the light, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that she lay still for a few minutes instead of getting up, looking at the ceiling of her room off the kitchen, the room that had a door that locked, that she'd been offered in exchange for 1 week's work, that had become in 11 months the most permanent address she'd had in 2 years. She'd slept in this room through a Nevada summer and a Nevada winter and into the beginning of a Nevada spring, and she knew its dimensions now the way you know a place you've slept in through all the moods of a year. The way the morning light came through the single window and moved across the floor, the particular sound the wind made when it came from the southwest versus the northwest, the exact creak of the floorboard near the door that she'd stopped noticing months ago and only remembered now because she was paying attention. After today, she would have a different room. That was the specific reality of the morning, underneath the larger and more obvious one. She got up and dressed and went to start the stove. Clara was already in the kitchen. This was unusual enough that Evelyn stopped in the doorway. It was barely 5:30. Clara was sitting at the table in her nightgown with Rust the cat in her lap, both of them looking at the cold stove with the patient air of creatures waiting for something to happen. "How long have you been up?" Evelyn said. "A while," Clara said. "Clara." "A long while," Clara admitted. Evelyn came and started the stove and put water on and sat down across from the girl and the cat. Clara's hair was loose, which it rarely was. It was usually braided by 6, a task Clara had taken over from Evelyn in December with the announcement that she was old enough to do it herself, which she was, mostly. The loose hair made her look younger. Made her look, Evelyn thought, like the 6-year-old she'd been when Evelyn arrived. The silent fair-haired girl with the rag doll and the evaluating stare. She was 7 now,
almost 8, and she talked constantly, which Dora Seelig said was making up for lost time, and which Caleb said was occasionally overwhelming, and which Evelyn found, without exception, a pleasure she hadn't gotten used to and hoped she never did. "Are you nervous?" Clara said. "A little," Evelyn said. Clara considered this. "Why?" "Because things that matter make you nervous," Evelyn said. "That's normal." "Papa was up early too," Clara said. "I heard him go out to the barn at 4. "He always goes to the barn when he's working something through," Evelyn said. "Is he nervous?" "Probably." Clara petted Rust, who submitted to this with his usual resigned dignity. "I'm not nervous," she said. "Good," Evelyn said. "One of us should be steady." "I've been thinking about it," Clara said. "About today." She looked at Evelyn directly in the way she'd been doing more lately, the childhood indirection mostly gone, this new quality of straight-line engagement in its place. "I've been thinking that you were supposed to marry someone else, and you ended up here instead." "That's right," Evelyn said. "What if Douglas Crane had come to the station?" Clara said. Evelyn looked at her. The question had the quality of something Clara had been sitting with for a while, turning it over, examining it from different sides. "Then I would have married him," Evelyn said, "and I wouldn't be here." "That would have been bad," Clara said, with simple certainty. "It might have been fine," Evelyn said, because she believed in telling Clara true things even when the easier version was available. "A different life. Not this one. But you wouldn't have been here," Clara said. "No." "So it's good that he didn't come," Clara said. Evelyn thought about this. About Douglas Crane somewhere in Elko County with his widow woman, going about a life that had no Evelyn Mercer in it, and about herself on the platform at Harrow Creek with $18.40 and a coyote calling once in the dark. About every specific accident and failure and misdirection that had produced this kitchen, this morning, this girl in her nightgown with a cat in her lap, asking the kind of question that children asked when they were trying to understand how the world arranged itself. "Yes," she said. "It's good that he didn't come." The water began to move in the pot. Outside, the light was strengthening, the pale Nevada dawn getting more specific about itself. And somewhere in the barn, Caleb was doing what Caleb did when he needed to think. Moving among the horses, working with his hands, letting the physical work do something for whatever was running through him. "Will you braid my hair?" Clara said. "Before Ada comes to help you with yours?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "Come here." Clara brought the chair around the table and sat with her back to Evelyn, and Evelyn unfolded the braid ribbon she'd bought in town specifically for today. A blue that matched Clara's eyes, which Evelyn had stood at the dry goods counter picking between 3 different shades of blue for longer than was strictly rational, and she began to braid. The wedding was held in the yard of the Boone Spread at 11 in the morning, which Caleb had chosen because he wanted it at home, and Evelyn had agreed because it seemed right that the place they'd built together was the place where they made it official. Amos Cleed officiated, which had a certain symmetry that Evelyn appreciated. The man who'd come to question the arrangement being the man who formalized it. He'd aged slightly since the summer, or maybe just looked more uncertain, and he performed his part with a quiet sincerity that was an improvement on his earlier performances. It was not a large gathering. Tom and Ada Parrish, with their children, who ran in the yard with the freedom of children at an outdoor event where the adults are too occupied to manage them. Dora Seelig, who stood near the front and looked at Evelyn with the expression of a woman who was not going to cry but was working at it. Gideon Phelps from the station, which had surprised Evelyn when Caleb mentioned he'd invited him. Phelps had looked at her on the platform 11 months ago with a walrus mustache and the careful kindness of a man who knew what he was delivering her to and was sorry about it. And here he was now in his good hat, standing in the yard of the ranch she'd walked toward in the dark. Bertrice Halloway came. She stood at the back with Earl, and she was wearing her best dress, and she didn't smile, but she didn't leave, which Evelyn took as the version of approval that was available from Bertrice Halloway and accepted it as such. Caleb was in his good shirt and a jacket she'd never seen before that fit him well enough that she suspected Ada Parrish's hand in its acquisition. He was standing at the front of the gathering with an expression of concentrated composure, the expression of a man who had prepared himself for this, the way he prepared for difficult ranch work, thoroughly, quietly, without making a performance of the preparation. He looked at her when she came across the yard. Just looked at her. Not the guarded, careful look of the early months, not the working through look of the middle ones. Just straight at her, the way he'd learned to look at things he wasn't going to look away from. She looked back. Clara walked beside her, holding Evelyn's hand with the firm grip she'd used since the boarding house in Harrow Creek, when she'd come alone across a mile of Nevada flatland to say the word please to a woman she'd known for one morning, and had not let go since. When they reached Caleb, Clara transferred Evelyn's hand to his and stepped to the side with the air of a person completing a task she'd been working on for almost a year. Amos Cleet began. The words were the ordinary words, the ones that had been said at 10,000 weddings before this one, and they were fine words. Not because they were unusual, but because they were true. Because they named the thing being done without ornamentation, to have and to hold, in good times and hard. Caleb said his part in his usual voice, unhurried and direct, like a man stating a thing he'd thought through and was certain of. Evelyn said hers and meant every syllable. When it was done, when Cleet said what Cleet said and the small gathered crowd made the sounds a small gathered crowd makes, Caleb held her hand for a moment before doing anything else. Just held it, the way he'd held his coffee cup on the first morning she'd made it, like something he hadn't expected to have and was being careful with. Well, he said, quietly, not for the gathering, just for her. Well, she said back. He almost smiled. The corner of his mouth, the slight movement at his eyes. Mrs. Boone, he said. She'd known it was coming. She'd signed the papers already. She'd known what the name would be. And it still did something to her when he said it. Not overwhelming, not cinematic, just real, the way the best things were real. Specific and slightly unexpected and entirely right. Mr. Boone, she said. Behind them, Clara made a sound of satisfied completion and went to find Ada Parrish's children. The spring of that year was the best the Boone spread had seen in 4 years. Though Caleb said this with the careful qualification of a man who'd learned not to trust good news until it had finished arriving. 23 new calves, all healthy. The north fence rebuilt in April with the help of Tom Parrish and his oldest boy, a solid job that Caleb walked twice and pronounced adequate, which from Caleb was high praise. The kitchen garden produced earlier than the previous year because Evelyn had amended the soil through the winter with composted materials she'd read about in an agricultural pamphlet Dora had ordered for the school library. The $940 from the Whitmore settlement had come through in March, transferred to the bank in Harrow Creek. They'd spent 3 evenings with the account book deciding what to do with it, not arguing because they didn't argue about money, which was one of the surprising discoveries of the first months of being married, that they had broadly compatible instincts about it, and had arrived at a division that felt right. A portion reinvested in the ranch, a fence post replacement, and 2 new breeding cattle. A portion held in reserve against hard seasons because they'd both lived through enough to know that good seasons were not permanent, and a portion set aside for Clara's education, which was Evelyn's particular addition to the account book, and which Caleb hadn't hesitated about for more than 30 seconds. She's smart, he said. She should have options. Yes, Evelyn said, she should. Like you did, he said. And then, after a moment, even if she ends up somewhere else because of it. Evelyn looked at him. He was looking at the account book. Is that hard to think about? She said. Yes, he said, without evasion. But it's right. She wrote the number in the account book and closed it. The schoolhouse expanded in May. Not physically, the building stayed what it was, but in scope, because Dora Seelig had spent the winter lobbying the county for additional funding and had won a partial victory that allowed a second teaching position to become a paid one rather than the informal arrangement Evelyn had been operating under. The salary was modest, genuinely modest as Dora had promised, but it was hers and it was regular, and it meant that the Boone household had 2 incomes for the first time, which changed the quality of the financial anxiety from constant background noise to something more occasional and manageable. Clara was in Dora and Evelyn's school. This had seemed, in theory, like it might be complicated, a child being taught by her stepmother in the same room where she was also a student. In practice, it was complicated in the specific small ways that real things were complicated and fine in all the large ones. Clara worked hard and expected no special treatment, which Evelyn respected, and occasionally received special criticism instead, which was not what Clara had expected. You gave me a lower mark than Thomas Riley, Clara said one evening at the table. Thomas Riley was the boy who read 3 grades ahead. Your composition had 2 sentences that said the same thing in different words, Evelyn said. Thomas Riley's had a spelling error. Spelling errors are correctable. Unclear thinking is a deeper problem. Clara stared at her. That's not fair. It's accurate, Evelyn said. Which is better than fair. Clara looked at Caleb for support. He was looking at the account book with the concentration of a man who was not going to involve himself in this particular territory and was hoping this was obvious. Papa, Clara said. I'm busy, he said. You're not busy. I'm very busy, he said. Clara looked back at Evelyn. Evelyn looked back at Clara. Clara's expression went through several phases. Indignation, reconsideration, reluctant acknowledgement, and arrived somewhere that wasn't quite agreement, but was in its neighborhood. Fine, Clara said. I'll rewrite it. Good, Evelyn said. But I still think it's not fair, Clara said, getting up. You're allowed to think that, Evelyn said. Think it and rewrite it. Clara went to the loft. Caleb put the account book down and looked at Evelyn. She's going to be formidable, he said. She already is, Evelyn said. She gets it from you, he said. She gets it from both of us, Evelyn said. And from Ruth, probably. She said it simply, the way she'd learned to say Ruth's name, not carefully, not as something requiring handling, but as part of the complete history of this family, that included her and Caleb and Clara and the woman who had been Clara's mother and Caleb's wife, and who had lived in this house before Evelyn and left her mark on it in ways Evelyn had been discovering for a year. The shape of the kitchen garden, which Ruth had started and Evelyn had continued. The particular placement of the water pump, which Ruth had insisted be closer to the house than Caleb had planned, and which Evelyn had been grateful for every single morning. The quilt on Clara's bed, stitched with a patience and precision that told you something about its maker. Caleb looked at her when she said it, something in his face quiet and real. Yeah, he said. Probably from Ruth, too. Summer came back around and the anniversary of Evelyn's arrival happened on a Thursday, unremarked officially, but present in her awareness the way significant dates were present, not loudly, but persistently. She'd been at the Boone spread for a year. She'd been Evelyn Boone for 3 months. Claire had turned 8 with a cake that had even more jam in the middle than last year's, because Evelyn had made an extra batch of jam specifically for the occasion. She rode out to the south pasture on the anniversary afternoon, the same fence rail she'd sat on in October when she'd worked through the Whitmore letter. The basin was different in June than it had been in October. Green in the places it could be green, the cattle spread across it with the unhurried certainty of animals who knew their territory. The sky was the summer blue, deeper and more certain than the fall blue, the kind of blue that looked like it went up forever. She sat on the fence and thought about the woman on the platform, the one who'd had $18.40 and a broken promise and no idea what she was walking toward when she followed a lantern through the Nevada dark, who'd slept in a barn and made biscuits for a man who didn't thank her and shown a silent child how to braid a horse's tail, who'd written lists of things she intended to do because lists were better than despair. She felt for that woman something she hadn't expected, not pity and not quite pride, something more complicated than either, a kind of tenderness, maybe, for someone who had been stripped down to the bare minimum of what she had available and had kept going anyway, not heroically, not cheerfully, but with the stubborn, persistent refusal to stop. That was the only thing she'd had left. The thing Evelyn understood now, that she hadn't understood then, was that the woman on the platform had not been broken. She'd felt broken, had been convinced in some cold part of the mind that arriving at a strange station with nothing was the end of something. But it had been, instead, the specific reduction that made the next thing possible. You had to be empty enough. You had to have run out of the life you'd built out of expectation and plan and respectable intention before you could see the life that was actually available. She hadn't chosen the reduction. She'd hated it. She would not recommend it. But she wouldn't undo it. The cattle moved in the basin below her and the fence was solid under her. The repaired fence, the one that had held since Caleb fixed it, and the ranch behind her was going about its June business. And inside the house was a man she'd married in April and a girl who checked jar seals and rewrote compositions she thought were unfair and had been talking nonstop for 14 months and showed no signs of stopping. And the kitchen had coffee in it, and the pantry was organized, and there were preserves on the shelf and a quilt on a bed that had been made by hands she'd never known and would take care of forever. This was what she'd found by following a lantern in the dark. Not what she'd expected, not what she'd planned, not what any reasonable person would have predicted from the outside. Exactly what she needed. She was still at the fence when Caleb rode up from the south. He saw her and slowed and came alongside the fence rail and stopped. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Anniversary," she said by way of explanation. He nodded. He sat his horse with the ease of a man who'd been riding since he could walk, comfortable and unhurried. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, "just thinking." "About what?" She looked at the basin. "About the station," she said. "A year ago." He was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about that night," he said. "What do you think about it?" "That I almost didn't stop," he said. "When I heard you call out, it was dark and I was tired and I almost just—" He looked at the basin. "Kept going." She looked at him. "But you didn't," she said. "I didn't," he said. They sat with that for a moment. The thing it meant, from both sides of it. Her following the lantern, him stopping the wagon, the series of small, unglamorous decisions made by two tired people in the dark that had produced everything that came after. "Claire's been trying to teach Russ to sit," he said. "I know," Evelyn said. "He's deeply resistant." "She's going to win," he said. "I know that too," Evelyn said. "She always does." He almost smiled. The corner of his mouth, the particular movement. She'd been watching it for a year and she still valued it, which told her something. "Come back when you're ready," he said. "Supper's going to be Clara's production tonight. She has plans." "That's alarming," Evelyn said. "Little bit," he agreed, and touched his hat brim and rode back toward the ranch, unhurried, man and horse moving through the June evening with the ease of things that belonged where they were. Evelyn watched him go. She thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that you could spend your whole life building toward what you thought you wanted, building and planning and constructing carefully from intentions and expectations and the respectable materials of a sensible life, and still find that the thing you actually needed arrived sideways, without announcement, in the form of a lantern crossing the dark on a night when you had nothing left to lose. It didn't mean the planning was worthless. It didn't mean you shouldn't know your own mind or fight for what you'd built or be clear-eyed about what you were choosing and why. All of that mattered. All of that was what made the arriving somewhere real rather than just landing somewhere by accident. But it meant you had to be willing to follow the lantern, even when it wasn't going where you'd planned, even when the ground was uneven and you couldn't see what was ahead, even when the sensible choice was to stay on the platform and wait for morning. Sometimes the lantern was the whole plan. She climbed down from the fence rail and walked back toward the house, and the Nevada evening opened up around her, enormous and unsentimental and entirely indifferent to her story, the way the land was indifferent, the way the stars would be indifferent later, the way all the large things were indifferent, and yet somehow the small things held. The specific small things, the people and the places, and the daily accumulation of ordinary effort that turned out, looked at whole, to be a life worth choosing. Clara's supper plans turned out to involve an ambitious attempt at cornbread, a pot of beans she'd been monitoring since 3 in the afternoon with the intensity of a field general, and a side dish she described as a salad that was primarily composed of things she'd pulled from the garden and arranged on a plate in a pattern she found aesthetically pleasing. "The beans need more time," Evelyn said, lifting the lid. "They've been cooking for 4 hours," Clara said. "And they need more time," Evelyn said. Clara made a sound. She looked at her father. "Don't look at me," Caleb said. "The cornbread is good," Evelyn said, because it was genuinely good, better than she'd expected, with a proper texture and a slight sweetness that came from Clara's decision to add a little more of the only molasses they had. "You got the cornbread right." Clara's expression shifted, the same movement it had always made when something was genuinely acknowledged. The small, private pleasure, quickly covered, the trying not to show she cared. She cared. She always had. That was the thing about Clara. She acted like someone who didn't need approval and was always paying attention to whether it came. "Thank you," Clara said to her cornbread. "You're welcome," Evelyn said to Clara. They ate the beans when they were ready, which was another 40 minutes. And the cornbread cooled slightly in that time, which actually improved it. And the salad was eaten with the diplomatic generosity of people who understood that aesthetic intention counted for something. Russ circled the table with the focused attention of an animal who has learned that Clara's cooking operations occasionally produced floor-level opportunities. After supper, Caleb and Clara washed up. This had become their arrangement. Dinner made by Evelyn or jointly, dishes managed by Caleb and Clara together, which had produced, as a side effect, the longest and most sustained conversations between the two of them that Evelyn had observed, the kind that happened naturally when two people had their hands occupied and weren't looking directly at each other. And Evelyn sat at the table with her coffee and the composition Clara had rewritten, which was genuinely better than the first draft, the repeated sentences gone, and in their place something sharper and more Clara in its directness. She made a note in its margin. Much better. The third paragraph especially. She heard Clara say something to Caleb at the wash basin that she couldn't quite make out, and Caleb's response, low and brief, and Clara's laugh, the full one, the one that was still slightly surprising to hear after the year of silence that had preceded it, that Evelyn didn't think she'd ever hear and not feel something about. She looked at the composition in her hands, looked around the kitchen, the curtains she'd hemmed in November, the preserves on the shelf, the repaired wall, the pantry that held what it was supposed to hold and could be found in, the hook by the door with Caleb's hat on it and her coat underneath and one of Clara's braided hair ribbons looped over both because Clara left things on every available hook and surface as a matter of principle. The woman who had come here to become someone else's bride had not become anyone's bride for 7 months. She'd become, instead, something harder to name and more valuable, the person who kept the stove going and the accounts straight and the garden honest, the person who taught a silent child that her voice was worth using, the person who stood in a room full of skeptical faces and didn't look away. She'd become necessary, which was different from being wanted, and she'd become wanted, which was different from being necessary, and the overlap between those two things was where she lived now. She hadn't crossed the country for this. She hadn't planned it, or anticipated it, or built toward it with any of the intention she normally brought to the construction of her life. She had arrived at it through misdirection and failure, and the specific grace of a child's hand in the dark. That was the thing nobody told you about starting over. They talked about it as if it was a clean vertical line. End of one thing, beginning of another, a fresh page. It wasn't like that. It was more like the kitchen garden in March, when you couldn't see yet what was going to make it and what wasn't, when the difference between a plant coming back and a plant that was done for looked exactly the same from the outside, and you just had to do the work and wait and trust that what was real would show itself. What was real had shown itself. Clara appeared from the kitchen with Rust under her arm and sat down across from Evelyn and saw the composition with the note in the margin and looked at it for a moment and then at Evelyn. "Much better?" she said. "The third paragraph especially," Evelyn said. Clara considered this with the judicious expression of someone deciding whether to accept a partial win or argue for a larger one. She accepted it. She arranged Rust on her lap with the authority of a girl who had outlasted a cat's resistance and knew it. "Evelyn," she said. "Yes." "I'm glad Douglas Crane didn't come to the station," she said. Evelyn looked at her. The lamp between them was the same lamp it had always been, the same low, warm light that made the kitchen look the way it looked at this hour, particular and real. "So am I," she said. Caleb came in from his kitchen, drying his hands, and looked at the two of them at the table, and didn't say anything, just poured himself more coffee and sat down in his chair, and the ranch settled into its evening sounds around them, and the Nevada dark came in full and starry outside the window, and the coyotes out on the flat started their conversation with the night the way they always did. Evelyn Boone sat at the table in the home she had built from an accident and kept by choice, and she listened to her family breathe. She had come here with nothing. She had found, in the way that only works if you're willing to follow the lantern, everything. Not a perfect everything, not a smooth one, and everything with cracked fence posts and difficult neighbors, and a cat who'd taken 6 weeks to consent to being held, and a child who argued about grades, and a man who had needed nearly 7 months to say what he meant. And everything that required daily work, and occasional courage, and the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided that this, exactly this, imperfect and real and entirely hers, was worth staying for. Outside, the Nevada night was enormous and indifferent and covered in stars. Inside, the stove was warm. That was enough. That had always been enough. She just needed to come far enough to understand it,